The Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Limit list has existed for nearly 20 years at this point. We've had 57 changes to Forbidden Limited cards since then. But instead of going over every individual card, today we'll be going over the biggest reason why cards find themselves placed on the Forbidden Limited list by Konami and why they stay there. Our first reason at the number 10 spot is that some cards are just incredibly unusual and cause all sorts of rules and gameplay execution problems. This category of cards are just cards that exist far too early on in Yu-Gi-Oh! And, while sometimes powerful, really are just inherently problematic in ways that are both hard to fix and are just not worth having around in a legal card pool. The poster child for this is obviously Last Turn, a card with more ruling nightmares than you can really count, and had a powerful enough effect to actually be relevant and force people to actually consider how this card works. Another great example is Victory Dragon, a card that interacts with the game completely outside of the game by having it affect your next game, and win you the entire match if it deals lethal damage. While a lot of folks will bring up how pointless this card is because you can just concede before it connects with an attack, that's not necessarily true in every format. In the OCG, and oftentimes in the combined OCG and TCG Worlds format, it often requires a judge approval to forfeit a game, making a card like Victory Dragon go from a gimmick to a legitimate existential rulings nightmare about cards breaking the confines of a single game and stretching over into another game. There's an entire series of promo and prize cards with Victory Dragon's effect who aren't legal to play, showing how Konami just does not want that rulings nightmare hanging around in the game for real. Some cards just cause problems by resolving in a tournament. Self-Destruct Button and Fiber Jar found themselves banned for either literally or functionally creating more games than the usual 3 games to a match format. The complete opposite of Victory Dragon, but a huge issue nonetheless, because constant draws could leave a match without a winner when time is called all too frequently. Another early rulings problem that found its way to the limited list was Twin-Headed Behemoth. It had a once per duel effect but didn't name itself, meaning you had to track which behemoth had used its effect or not. Impossible if you happen to shuffle them all back into your deck. Konami used a limited list to make it so there was only ever one Twin-Hidden Behemoth legal. So if you use its effect, there would be no other behemoths to mix it up with, and you could know not to use its effect. While these last few cards aren't nearly powerful enough in the abstract to be banned, they're just too wonky and affect the game at a level above the regular game, and it's not worth the trouble of having them legal. These are the kinds of cards that are the least likely to ever come off the list without serious erratas, which you can see in the effect with Twin-Headed Behemoth's errata. There aren't a lot of them, but these rule-jumbling monstrosities have been a mainstay of the Forbidden Limited list for years. And while Konami usually does a good job of not having game-breaking rulings problems printed, these few cards will serve as a historical fixture on the list for years to come as a testament to Konami's earliest mistakes and how they used banning as a solution to it. And at number 9 on this list, we have consistency hits. One of the main functions of the Forbidden Limited list isn't always just to ban cards that are too powerful or too degenerate to remain in the game. Konami often uses the limited and semi-limited spots to rein in decks that are overperforming or just have been too good for too long. On the most recent list as of this recording, Konami hit the relatively new Purely archetype by limiting Purely Delicious Memory. While people were surprised at a deck that just so recently been released to the TCG getting a significant hint to arguably its best extender, Konami has never been afraid to use these minor hits to weaken, but not to completely destroy, current meta-relevant decks. Delicious Memory's effect isn't really powerful enough to warrant being limited to 1, but it is a very impactful hit on the deck's consistency. And most of the time when this happens, they will leave those cards limited for quite some time afterwards as a precaution. An example of that would be Salamangreat Gazelle. While Salamangreat was a great deck in TOS format, it wasn't significantly better than most of the decks around it. Though the rest of the TOS format's headline decks also receive their own hits, and many remain on the list to this day. For instance, Sky Striker Mobilize Engage has been bouncing up and down the Forbidden Limited list for years due to how powerful of a card it is. Though its strength in Sky Striker as a consistency piece isn't the only reason. Aside from Purely Delicious Memory, the other recent hits on the list to combatant meta strategies include the semi-limitation of Kashtira Unicorn, who serves as Kashtira's best starter thanks to its ability to search out Kashtira's incredibly powerful spells. Or Sprite Starter, who, despite Sprite's other hits on the ban list like Sprite Elf, is by far Sprite's most powerful engine card, and hard drawing it can really up the deck ceiling, as it can let Sprite Jet search Sprite Smashers instead of needing the Sprite Starter to continue their combos. Sometimes these hits can be a bit questionable though, as another new member on the semi-limited list is Runic Fountain. Fountain's ability to draw 3 cards in both players' turns is undeniably powerful, and the fact that it's not a hard once per turn meant that sometimes a Runic player could draw 6 on their own turn if they're cycled through enough Runic spells. But the semi-limitation was questionable, as Runic decks rarely played more than 2. And every single Runic Quick Play spell can search it out thanks to their ability to summon Hyujin the Runic Wings, who can search Runic Fountain, giving the deck upwards of 20 cards that can search Fountain. Still, when Konami sees a deck overperforming by their expectations, Their first act is almost always to run out a series of limitations and semi-limitations. Maybe the best example of this in practice is the Dragon Rulers, where Konami kept hitting cards around the Dragon Rulers like all the Baby Rulers and support cards like Super Rejuvenation to keep the Dragon Rulers decks alive but severely weaken its consistency. Though, in that case, it didn't work as they eventually had to limit and then ban the Dragon Rulers for continuing to dominate for too long. Despite overpowered cards receiving bans being the highlight of most of the Forbidden Limited list adjustments, the majority of Konami's changes historically to the list actually fall within this category where they're largely limiting and semi-limiting minor problems and banning support cards. Next up at number 8, we have searching for cards. Searching for cards out of the deck has been a mainstay of Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever since the Warrior Toolbox days as early as 2003 with reinforcements of the army, affectionately dubbed Rhoda by the community. This searched out tons of powerful utility monsters like Exiled Force to threats like Don Zaluk, and had such an impact on the game that basically any normal spell that can search a monster out of your deck often gets called a Rhoda. This kind of generic searching of one of the best creature types in the game earned Rhoda a long stay on the limited list, as even to this day, having multiple copies would make the limitation of powerful warriors like Armageddon Knight or Dark Grepher trivial if you had 3 Rhodas hanging around. This logic exists to fellow limited spells Set Rotation and Terraforming. While it took longer for their power to manifest thanks to field spells being absolutely trash for years, once good field spells started being a staple of archetypes with the advent of cards like Dragon Ravine, Union Hanger, Spiral Resort, and others, suddenly making all of these powerful cards go from 3 copies to functionally 6 with Terraforming and potentially 9 with Set Rotation was an issue. It's not just generic searchers that get limited either, as Dragonic Diagram, Infinity Arcfiend, and Gateway the Six all received long-term limitations for a similar lack of hard once per turn searching despite being locked to their respective archetypes. Turns out, if your archetype has good cards to search, potentially unrestricted searchability is pretty great. But the real criminals of this list are the cards that search far too many cards for the health of the game or were too easily accessible. Zodiac Broadbull can only search 1 Beast Warrior, and while the effect was a soft once per turn, you usually only used it once a turn anyhow. The problem was twofold with Broadbull, as the card it searched was usually Zodiac Rat Pure, a limit and ban-worthy powerful card on its own right. On top of the fact that Broadbull was always easily accessible due to being in the extra deck and summonable off of any Zodiac normal summon thanks to Zodiac's incredible powerful cheating of the XC's summoning restrictions. Other bannable cards just search way too often. Spiral Master Plan, Eva, and Block Dragon are all very similar cards in that sense. Block Dragon was quite easy to summon and quite easy to search thanks to Gallant Granite, so its graveyard effect at 3 rock monsters was an absolutely broken amount of advantage once paired with good rock monsters in the Emancipators. Eva functioned similarly, enabling a mass searching of fairy cards over 2 turns when paired with Drytron and the Herald Ritual monsters, being able to search 4 total fairies over 2 turns to set up crazy amounts of negation. Unlike those two, Spiral Master Plan was limited to searching only her archetype cards in the Spiral missions with her on-field effect, and a Spiral Monster and Spiral Resort with her second Graveyard effect. And while her Graveyard effect only searched 2 cards compared to Block Dragon's 3, her on-field effect lacked a hard once per turn, which is where the real problem starts. It was very typical to see Spirals searching upwards of 6 cards in 1 turn with Master Plan. It also didn't help that Spiral had a monster that could summon her straight from the deck in Spiral Double Helix, and one of the monsters she would search off, Spiral Quick Fix, also lacked a hard once per turn on its search effect and would search upwards of 6 cards in a turn too, making her just as accessible as other broken searchers, but also leading into bigger plays with the sheer advantage generation. Searching is a fundamental part of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and basically every good deck these days searches out cards one way or another to be able to consistently implement their game plan. But some cards just do it a bit too well to stay off the forbidden and limited list. Next up at number 7, we have making tokens. Making tokens has been an important part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever since Scapegoat's printing, a card which has an entire format named after the pace of play that singular card sets up. And for a long time, Scapegoat was fine as a limited card, until the Synchro era came around. Synchro monsters were the first extra deck mechanic to really make use of tokens, loving that generic material creation. A card like Scapegoat suddenly went from a powerful defensive tool to a defensive tool that immediately sets up a huge Synchro summon on the next turn with any tuner, which earned it a stint on the forbidden list. The Synchro era also introduced Dandelion, likely the second most prolific token generator of all times besides Scapegoat itself. Dandelion's lack of a once per turn and ability to summon 2 tokens into the graveyard from anywhere nearly immediately made it a candidate for the limited list, and even then Dandelion was the backbone of dozens of Synchro era decks. But that was small potatoes compared to what happened when Link monsters arrived. Link monsters suddenly turned any generic token creation into a swarm of crazy extra deck plays. Suddenly, Dandelion represented 2 Link materials, and a previously fringe card in Blackwing Go for the Vague Shadow became an immediate staple card in every deck that could Link summon, as its restrictions didn't affect Link summoning at all. While most Link monsters do prevent themselves from being summoned with tokens, either by explicitly excluding tokens or demanding monsters with effects or monsters with different names, the existence of cards like Link Karibo and Link Spider could transform most tokens into legitimate Link materials. Scapegoat had been unbanned for several years before the Link era, but immediately had to go back to being limited thanks to these Link 1s enabling all sorts of plays. The most problematic cards aren't main deck token creators though, but the various extra deck token creators. Link Cross and Mega Phantom Beast Auroradon helped transform basically any Link deck into a deck that could access powerful Synchro boss monsters on top of the already powerful Link monsters. While both are known for working in tandem with their overpowered partner in crime, Kriston Halki Fibrax, Auroradon on its own represented a Synchro summon thanks to its ability to summon Mega Phantom Beast O-Line, which earned O-Line a 2-year trip on the list while Auroradon remained legal, representing another token generator ban thanks to O-Line's double duty of being a tuner and making a token upon hitting the graveyard. And the problem wasn't just with accessing Synchro summons either, as once the Link pool expanded to be powerful enough on its own, a card like number 42 Galaxy Tomahawk went from a completely forgettable monster to a Link material making catastrophe, representing up to 6 total material on summon now that Link monsters existed to actually do something with its previously board clogging effect. Similarly, thanks to Link monsters like Security Dragon, Acoustic Magician, and Fireball Dragon's ability to bounce monsters, Grinder Golem was maybe the worst offender in the OCG of token-based Link generation. It easily produced over 8 Link materials in any deck, but also had degenerate infinite loops with Fireball Dragon before its errata in combination with other engines like Brilliant Fusion. If not for the slower rollout of Link monsters compared to the OCG, TCG would have likely had to ban it immediately as well. And this card was basically unplayable before Link monsters existed. Even smaller token Link climbing engines like Sky Striker Mecha Hornet Drones combined with Sky Striker Ace Kagari for a mere 2 free Link materials was strong enough to get Hornet Drones limited ever since its release. While the speed of the game has allowed Scapegoat to come off because it at least has the same turn special summon restriction, and O-Line ceased being a problem with Auroradon gone, all of these other generic token producers are unlikely to ever escape their vacation on the Forbidden Limitless so as long as Link summoning is still around. And at number 6, we have causing burn damage. For a long time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, the most effective way to kill your opponent was to just burn them to death for a paltry 8,000 life points on your first turn, turning Yu-Gi-Oh from a battle between 2 players into an exciting game of coin flips and solitaire. This trend dates back to one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most powerful and abusable monsters, Magical Scientist. This card's first greatest crime was pairing with Catapult Turtle and a ton of spells meant to get both of them on the field at the same time, like Last Will. The 2 on the board together represented 8,050 damage even back in the early 2000s, and was TCG's first consistent FTK strategy. This would be a huge part of what got Magical Scientist banned, and got Catapult Turtle's effect in errata that give it a hard once per turn. That said, Magical Scientist is broken enough that, even without any burn style FTKs, it would always be bannable. There's plenty of other examples of burn enablers or just plain burn cards on the ban list. Mass Driver is an obvious one as the core game-winning burn card in the infamous Frog FTK that would abuse Substitoad and Ronotoad to fill up the graveyard with the frogs, and send 20 of them in your opponent's face with Mass Driver, pulling off the FTK and earning Mass Driver's long-time tenure on the ban list. Phoenician Cluster Amaryllis both does the summoning and the burn damage, and through an elaborate combo would set up a ton of plans in the graveyard to banish for its effects in the end phase. Then, so as long as you had Topologic Bomber Dragon on the field, Amaryllis would summon itself, get destroyed by Topologic Bomber Dragon's effect, and repeat the process a total of 10 times for 8,000 damage. This same style FTK was established with Samsara Lotus, who could infinitely summon itself with minimal setup, and only needed a burn enabler to abuse this infinite summoning, which is where Trickstar Black Catbat and Nightmare Cerberus came into play. Cerberus would keep Catbat alive from Topologic's effect, and Catbat would provide the 200 burn damage every time Samsara would get blown up by Topologic. One of the most infamous banned burning baddies is Tempest Magician, who could burn a player for 500 damage for each spell counter on your field. Spell counter strategies were never good enough to enable this as anything but a gimmick game-closing finisher for over a decade, until Endymion Pendulum decks came around. This created an entire meta-relevant strategy around stacking tons of spell counters, turning Tempest Magician into an all-time busted FTK tool overnight, after a long time of being only occasionally playable. For some cards on this list, it's not even necessarily that they have effects that cause burn damage, but have the capability of copying a card that can burn. Lyrilless Independent Nightingale is an infamous burn enabler whose effect is largely to blame for the banning of 2 cards, the Tyrant Neptune, and Supreme King Starving Venom Dragon. Nightingale's effect of burn based on its level is fairly innocuous with its own total of 1 stars. But when copied by higher level monsters who lack once per turns, suddenly that burn damage becomes a hyper consistent FTK. Even a card like Gem Knight Master Diamond is stuck in the limited list because it can copy its fellow archetype burn damage monster Gem Knight Lady Lapis Lazuli, and in multiples could copy the effect enough to FTK. The OCG has gone a step further, banning other burn cards that lack once per turns, like Candid Soldier and Amazoness Archer for their history of burn FTK strategies. Burn is largely a niche effect in most Yu-Gi-Oh strategies that can employ it, but the most powerful effects with the highest potential almost always lead to degenerate strategies that end games far too fast. These kinds of effects pop up here and there throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and basically every time they become too good, something gets banned or limited to stop it. Next up at number 5 on this list, we have Hand Ripping. Hand Ripping is any effect that lets you strip a card out of your opponent's hand, whether it's banishing it, shuffling it back into the deck, or the most common option, playing discarding it from their hand. Hand Ripping was exceedingly common in the early stages of Yu-Gi-Oh! 3 of the core staple spells of the bygone DM era are Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and Forceful Sentry, which all gave the first turn player an immense advantage. Delinquent Duo was a hard +1 in card advantage, often making it the best. But Forceful Sentry and Confiscation gave you hand knowledge and let you avoid helping your opponent discard something that might be useful in the graveyard. Hand Control was even one of Yu-Gi-Oh's best early decks, revolving around cards like Down Zalug and Spirit Reaper to strip even more cards out of the hand, and even earn Spirit Reaper a decent stay in the limited list. As Yu-Gi-Oh became faster, shutting down your opponent's plays before their first turn became increasingly more powerful. This led to slower but still useful plays on turn 1 in Trap Dust Shoot to become highly played despite its restriction to only monsters, and only against a hand of 4 or more cards. It became such an auto-include in basically every deck because of its power going first, that Trap Dust Shoot joined its other DM era hand rips on the ban list. Maybe the funniest example of this is the most recent card sent to Forbidden List in this category, Appointer of the Red Lotus. For years, Appointer didn't see much play because it had a significant life point cost, gave your opponent hand information as well, and return the card back to them at the end phase. So as long as there were more than 3 turns in a game, Appointer was a huge net negative. But, as you might be able to tell, Yu-Gi-Oh! Speed has become more and more extreme with the years, and Appointer went from a joke version of Trap Dust Shoot to arguably a better card, as it wasn't limited to just monsters and could still hit hands with less than 4 cards in them. A more and more common situation with hand traps being available to empty early. And that got Appointer a spot beside its spiritual predecessor in Trap Dust Shoot as one of the few banned normal trap cards. Similarly, Smoke Grenade of the Thief was an absolutely unplayable card for basically 17 years, being another DM era card that immediately became ban-worthy once it had a home thanks to Infernoble decks being able to loop it. And, well, the second a hand rip card becomes playable, it becomes problematic. Maybe the greatest example in history of the biggest problems with hand ripping is Topologic Gumblar Dragon. While most hand rip cards on this list usually only take 1 card out of the hand, Gumblar was a well-known linker of Yu-Gi-Oh! For ripping 4 or more cards before your opponent ever had a chance to do anything. Psyframe Lord Omega is limited for a similar reason, as it lacks a hard once per turn, which meant decks would frequently summon 3 of them in 1 turn to rip 3 cards out of your opponent's hand. Hand ripping is one of the most powerful and hard to interact with effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the list has been filled with cards that do it for years. As more and more hand rip strategies become effective, more and more cards find their way onto the list. The second a card that hand rips becomes too accessible and too easy to fit into a deck, it's usually not too long before it takes a trip behind the ban curtain, never to be seen again. And on the other side of the coin, at number 4, we have drawing cards. Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game has treated card draw as the ultimate form of power for quite some time. Pot of Greed is infamous both in and outside of Yu-Gi-Oh! For its straightforward, simple, and fundamentally broken effect to draw 2 cards at no other cost. It automatically makes any hand +1 card better and is the staple amongst staples in Yu-Gi-Oh! And much like the hand ripping cards, there's a large group of old DM era staples that are all about drawing a bunch of cards. Joining up the Pot of Greed is the arguably more powerful card, Graceful Charity, the high risk high reward card, Mirage of Nightmare, and the near infinite value of Card of Safe Return. Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity were the true staples, with Pot of Greed's hard card advantage and Graceful Charity's ability to dig 1 card deeper and set up your graveyard. Mirage of Nightmare seemingly has a downside that makes it come out card neutral or even negative while getting to see more cards, but clever players quickly learned that any effect that could destroy Mirage of Nightmare before you had to pay the downside met a potential draw 4. Even accounting for Nightmare and the card you destroy it with, that's still a +2 overall, making it potentially more powerful than Pot of Greed. Card a Safe Return was the late bloomer of the DM era draw machines, but its lack of a hard once per turn meant players could draw as many times as they could special summon from the graveyard. And before its ban, that was upwards of 5 to 6 cards a turn. And in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you could basically draw your entire deck with this condition. One of the oddest things about Yu-Gi-Oh is how even cards like Upstart Goblin, Into the Void, and Chicken Game find themselves limited or banned, in the case of Chicken Game, as the card only draws 1 but with downsides. In the abstract, this means nothing. A 1-for-1 trade isn't usually problematic, but the overall effect to make your deck functionally smaller was the original reason for, say, Upstart Goblin being hit. A 37 card deck was that much more consistent than a 40 card deck that wasn't running 3 Upstart Goblins, and had to play 3 cards that were worse than their other 37, as some cards in the deck have to be the weakest. But a bigger problem is, if all 3 of these cards are unlimited, you can suddenly put together hyper-consistent decks. Playing 9 draw 1s even with downsides means any basic game-winning combo can be that much faster to find. Not to mention the inherent synergy and potential to draw your entire deck these cards famously had with World Magical Library, a card that is almost only ever seen in decks that need bans for its ability to draw too many cards, but has dodged the list so far. One Day Apiece is in a similar category to these other cards, and also limited to 1 for similar reasons. But its ability to blank out the battle phase and force your opponent to draw cards also earned it a place in very unusual deck out style FTK decks like the Gishki FTK that was forcing your opponent to draw cards to deck them out. Card of Demise is a great example of how, even with stacking tons of downsides on a card, drawing cards is just so good it's almost always worth it somewhere. The downsides of the card compared to most card draw spells are enormous, with locking out a special summon in the same turn and discarding your hand in the end phase being the most important ones. Most players want to draw more cards so they can dig to their special summon heavy combos after all. But it turns out, if you just play a lot of back row interactions, floodgate style monsters, or an entire archetype that only tribute summons and relies on back row like True Draco, then the +2 in card advantage was an enormous boon without any real drawback, since they would just play multiple tribute monsters and set the rest of their cards. Sky Striker Mobilize Engage has been on every part of the ban list at one point, and while it's currently semi-limited, it had once been banned because people would splash a mini Sky Striker engine with it, with Kagari and Mecha Hornet drones just to access Engage potential draw 1 alongside its search, giving every deck a potential pot of greed level card with few downsides. Drawing cards on your own turn isn't even everything, as the infamous Maxi turns any card draw from a consistency tool to a game-breaking advantage swing by drawing you an absurd number of cards to force your opponent to spend their turn without special summoning. Short of outright winning the game, drawing cards is perhaps the most powerful Yu-Gi-Oh mechanic that players are always trying to find ways to access. And whenever something is too good at drawing cards, you're almost always going to see it find its way somewhere on the list. Next up at number 3, we have dumping cards into the graveyard. While dumping cards into the grave might seem less powerful to just drawing cards or searching them, don't let that fool you. Ever since the earliest stages of the TCG, players have been using the graveyard as a resource thanks to recursion cards like Monster Reborn. And as time has gone on, more and more cards have been given graveyard effects. So while Foolish Burial might seem like an inherent -1 for costing you a card to send a monster to the graveyard, so many monsters have incredible graveyard effects that it's almost always as good as going equal or better. Foolish Burial is close in power level to one-off searchers like Reinforcements of the Army. Powerful for its generic nature, but not so powerful that having one in the format is going to cause too many problems, as it's not like you're guaranteed to draw it, so you can't build your deck around it. Foolish Burial is only really limited because, like Rhoda, it doesn't have a once per turn. The real problem with dumping cards at the graveyard is cards that let you choose what you're sending or effects that dump a ton of cards into the graveyard. Lavalval Chain and Curious Lightsworn Dominion have taken up residence on the ban list for their capability to send anything, spell, trap, or monster, to the graveyard. Curious would often send incredibly powerful trap cards like Eradicator Epidemic Virus or Anti-Spell Fragrance to turn these effects into consistent strategies. Not to mention, Curious' secondary milling effect would often net you value in any deck that has graveyard synergies. Lavalval Chain was famous for powering Infernity combos, and set up a special summon lock with Jin, Releaser Rituals, and Necroz. These abilities to send any card, as well as permanent availability by being in the extra deck, is what makes them far too powerful compared to something like Foolish Burial, which earned them a well-deserved spots on the Forbidden list. Perhaps the most broken card in this category are cards that send a bunch of cards to the graveyard. Painful Choice is perhaps the most well-known graveyard setup card ever, letting you bin 4 cards of your choice while still going card neutral in hand as your opponent gives you the worst option. A resolved Painful Choice was so powerful that even with the lower power card pool of the DM era, It was often going +2 or 3 in resolution thanks to cards like Sinister Serpent, or powerful recursion targets like Dark Magician of Chaos being in its piles. This mass dumping at one point extended to Future Fusion, which could send 5 dragon cards of your choice by revealing a 5-headed dragon, which earned it a ban at one point before an errata made this effect take an extra turn. Speaking of dragons, one of the most absurd card dumping monsters ever, number 95, Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon, dumped 3 differently named dragons of your choice, making it nearly as good as pre-errata Future Fusion while being consistently accessible out of the extra deck, enabling all sorts of strategies for FTKs, or setting up nearly insurmountable floodgates and boss monsters. The most recent addition to this list, Chaos Ruler the Chaotic Magical Dragon, was terrorizing basically every format it was part of for years just for being easy to summon and binning 5 random cards off the top of your deck while being able to add one of them to the hand most of the time. The entire Tier Limits archetype floods the Ban Unlimited list in tandem with the Yugioh cards as an entire Tier 0 deck in recent memory, whose entire strategy revolved around dumping as many cards of the graveyard as you could, and enabling powerful effects for your efforts, whether it was fusing with Tier Limit monsters or getting more meals or quick effect graveyard disruptions with the Yugiohs. Mass dumping cards to the graveyard with these cards defined arguably the most overall powerful deck in the history of the game to this point. And I would be remiss not to mention perhaps the most absurd card ever at dumping cards to the graveyard, that Grass Looks Greener. It has the potential to mill 20 or more cards in most formats thanks to Grass decks playing 60 cards, and most other decks wanted to play closer to 40. Basically, nothing in the game compares to resolving that Grass Looks Greener deck with graveyard effects. It's comparable to drawing 3 extra hands worth of value all off of one card, and is probably the best example of why cards that fill up your graveyard are often subject to a long time trip to the Forbidden Unlimited list. And the second biggest reason for cards at this list is that they create powerful floodgate effects. Or, like in the case of the card Branded Expulsion, are directly related to enabling an extremely difficult to deal with floodgate. Floodgates in general have been very powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever since Skill Drain Beatdown and Burn decks abusing Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B were top decks in the DM era, with all of these cards finding their way onto the limited list at one point. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to floodgates. With Yu-Gi-Oh!'s increased pace of play, and the higher focus on decks piecing together several monster effects, powerful spells, and special summons throughout a turn, oftentimes the best way to win in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to make it so your opponent can't play. Some floodgates are just far too easy to splash into any deck and have way too big of an impact for such a minor cost. Cards like Imperial Order can be functionally one-sided, as you can play all the spells you want on your own turn, and then just flip Imperial Order on your opponent's turn and reap all of the benefits of the floodgate with none of the consequences. With special summoning being so important, the same situation arises with Vanity's Emptiness and Royal Oppression. It's incredibly hard for modern decks to play without special summoning, and any deck being able to play these backbreaking cards often turns formats into a game of who won the coin flip and who drew the overpowered purple card. Some decks might have some in-engine outs to these cards though. A deck like Adamantipator might run Tackle Crusader, or Spiral could run Spiral Tough, who can destroy back row without special summoning. So why not just shut down monsters entirely with arguably the best floodgate ever in Mystic Mine? Still, despite their ban-worthy power level, these cards are all much harder to consistently access and easier to interact with than really big problems. The worst kinds of floodgates are the kind that you have nearly no opportunity to interact with. We did a whole top 10 video on lingering effects that include many of these cards that you might be interested in, but the biggest culprits are cards like number 16 Shockmaster and Arch Nemesis Protoss, who can activate their effects on the player's turn and have a floodgate that extend into your opponent's turn with nothing they can play in their turn to affect it. Or a monster like Outer Entity Azathoth, who doesn't start a chain when summoned. So once it hits the board, no amount of interaction matters anymore. Sometimes the floodgate is attached to a protected monster that has functionally no way to be dealt with, like number 86 Heroic Champion Rongo Miniad. The previously mentioned Branded Expulsion is just like that, as it has the ability to summon something like Gimmick Puppet Nightmare to the field to prevent victims from summoning anything at all. And the only counter to it once it's set up is Red Reboot. Incidentally, Red Reboot is banned for being too powerful as an anti-trap card that floodgates the target for playing any more traps for a turn, while being a counter-trap speed itself, so only other counter-trap cards can ever interact with it. Floodgates, by their very nature, they protect themselves by limiting your opponent's potential options, and thus limiting their potential cards they can play to deal with them. Floodgates are a combination of incredibly powerful interaction, incredibly hard to deal with interaction, and incredibly frustrating to play against, because most of the time when a floodgate is good, the gameplay just devolves into one player not getting to try to play their cards. Even a card as relatively simple as Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds has found itself on the ban list, despite maybe being the easiest floodgate ever to out by just normal summon a monster with more than 1000 attack. Even this easy to out but still powerful floodgate becomes problematic when it becomes too easy to implement, as it was with Flunderies or with Simorgh Bird of Sovereignty before the latter was banned, or when a simple floodgate is backed by another interaction to protect it. Floodgates take up an enormous amount of the Forbidden Limited list at any given time, with over 22 cards banned at the time of this recording for either being a floodgate or enabling one at some point, with even more on the limited list. There's almost nothing in Yu-Gi-Oh! That gets abused to the degree that Konami has to exterminate it from a format as much and as often as floodgating, short of one very important mechanic. And taking the top spot on this list of reasons that get cards placed on the Forbidden Limited list, we have special summoning. Now, special summoning is so incredibly common in Yu-Gi-Oh! That most cards that can enable such a basic mechanic are hardly problematic. But when you have over 5,000 cards in your 12,000 card pool mention special summon in some way, by the sheer weight of numbers, of course, this effect was going to be at the top of the list. The strongest example for this mechanic at its worst, Magical Scientist, shows off maybe one of the most dangerous kinds of special summoning. Special summoning monsters from the extra deck while bypassing their summoning requirements. The extra deck is where a lot of power in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Lies, and while Magical Scientist was banned for its burn FTK shenanigans mentioned previously, and is an insane toolbox option for cards like Thousand Eyes Restrict way back in the early days, it's hard to describe just how absurdly powerful Magical Scientist would be in the modern game, with free access to Links, Xyz, and Synchros to summon by cheating out basically as many fusion monsters you want. Similar cards like Cyberstein and Metamorphosis are banned for usually only doing this effect once, with Guard Dragon Agripane sitting on the ban list for cheating out just dragon monsters in a similar way. Some monsters can basically special summon something infinitely many times, like how Fishborg Blaster, Level Eater, and Ronin Totem, with their lack of once per turns, just keep popping back on the field after you use them for material for an extra deck play, or how Mind Master can just summon as many psychic monsters as you want. This effect has some overlap with the previous entry on this list, Token Summoning, as Grinder Golem's penchant for infinitely resummoning itself so as long as you can bounce it is the second half of why it's so broken, along with the token generation. Special summoning is so ubiquitous and so powerful that every other entry on this list has a special summoning card somewhere in their roster that enables them. Phoenician Cluster Amaryllis is banned for being a burn FTK enabler, but only can do so because of how it can special summon itself. Card a Safe Return can draw your entire deck for if you want, but requires you to special summon monsters from the graveyard to do so. Half the time, sending monsters to the graveyard is only broken because it enables some crazy special summoning plays, like Fairy Tale Snow being able to summon itself from the graveyard forever, so as long as you keep filling up the graveyard. Some cards are banned just for summoning a ton of monsters at once, like Dimension Fusion, Return from the Different Dimension, or perhaps the worst culprit of all, Soul Charge, who all have the potential to mass summon monsters you've either banished or put in your graveyard from your previous plays. The list just keeps going. As of today, there's 192 cards populating the Forbidden Limited list, and 82 of those cards have to do with special summoning either themselves or other monsters. And that's underselling it, as some cards don't summon themselves or other monsters, but might enable broken special summoning otherwise, like Spiral Master Plan, or adding cards that can special summon to the hand, or Thunder Dragon Colossus being banned in part because it's just too easy to special summon by ignoring its own summoning requirements. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game largely about special summoning, and really more often about trying to break certain special summon mechanics to absurd degrees. It's the biggest and most common reason any card will ever find itself riding off into the sunset on the Forbidden Limited list, and that earns it the top spot on our list. In this video, we'll go over 10 cards that are currently banned who have effects that are so good that they'll probably never be unbanned unless they change the effect of the card itself. And at number 10, we have Victory Dragon. This card has the effect to basically win you an extra duel if you're able to win with this card, as it has the effect, if it inflicts direct damage to your opponent's life points and reduces them to 0, you then win the match. So if you pull this card off during the first duel of a best 2 out of 3 match, then it will auto-win your next duel. Now, this card has a whole bunch of limitations and restrictions to it though. It can't be special summoned, it requires 3 tributes to be summoned, and those 3 tributes must be dragon-type monsters, and it does require you to basically put yourself in a position where this card is attacking directly in order to win. Now, the effect of Victory Dragon is the most common effect given to illegal cards, which are generally given out as prize cards because they have cool-looking artwork. They all basically just have match winner effects, and Victory Dragon is the only match winner effect that's not an illegal card to play. It's just banned on the ban list. And there are so many cards that are illegal to play in any kinds of decks, even in duels which allow banned cards, like traditional format, that it's very unlikely they'll ever let Victory Dragon off the ban list, even if its effect is not super good, as you can counter this effect by simply surrendering the duel before its attack takes place, as you can technically surrender whenever you want. So if you're going to lose anyway, you can just prevent this card's attack from going through by just conceding the duel to your opponent, and then go into the next game of the match. So the effect is almost useless if playing against someone who knows this little trick, which is why it's only at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Butterfly Dagger Elma. This is an equipped spell card which just gives the monster it's equipped to 300 attack. And it also has an effect that when this card is destroyed while equipped, you can return this card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, this doesn't seem so bad at first, until you realize this effect is not once per turn, and doesn't require any kind of resources to return to your hand. So, if you have a way to infinitely destroy this card on the field, and some way to infinitely gain advantage off of destroying this card or activating spell cards, then you could activate this card an infinite amount of times during your turn. And there are cards that allow you to do those kinds of things. Gearfried the Iron Knight can destroy this card as soon as it's equipped to itself, and Royal Magical Library allows you to place a spell counter on it each time a spell card is activated. So if you just infinitely equipped Butterfly Dagger Elma to Gearfried the Iron Knight, which will then infinitely recycle back to your hand, you can generate an infinite amount of spell counters to draw an infinite amount of cards, as Royal Magical Library allows you to remove 3 spell counters for it to draw 1 card, which is not once per turn. So generally, cards that allow you to perform actions an infinite amount of times are kind of broken and just ripe for all kinds of abuse, which is why this card is currently banned, but they could probably unlimit the card if they just gave it a once per turn clause. And at number 8, we have Delinquent Duo. Now, this card simply has the effect where you can pay 1,000 life points to discard 1 random card from your opponent's hand. Then your opponent gets to choose another card in their hand to discard. So basically, you pay 1,000 life points to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand. Now, I remember back in the day when I was still new to Yu-Gi-Oh! And I saw Delinquent Duo in one of those Yu-Gi-Oh! Magazines, they were talking about how good this card was, and I just didn't understand why. How could paying 1,000 life points just to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand possibly be a good effect? Well, it turns out, discarding from your opponent's hand, especially during your first turn, can prevent them from playing the game if you hit the correct cards. Especially if it's an inherent +1 in card advantage, like with Delinquent Duo, where you're using 1 card in your hand to get rid of 2 resources from your opponent. And losing 1,000 life points isn't even a bad cost, because back then I thought that was just unplayable. And generally, the hand is the hardest place to target for removal effects because of how absolutely disruptive it could be. Which is why a much weaker card like Trap Dust Shoot is also banned, even though it's a trap card which requires your opponent to have 4 more cards in their hand and only gets rid of 1 of those cards. There's also a card called Topologic Gumblar Dragon, which requires you to discard random cards from your hand in order to have your opponent discard the same number of random cards from their hand. You don't even really gain advantage from Topologic Gumblar Dragon, and its effect is so good that it got placed on the ban list. And Delinquent Duo is a better Gumblar Dragon effect. Though, to be fair, Gumblar Dragon does have the potential to get rid of more cards in Delinquent Duo. But the fact that Delinquent Duo is effortless in its removal, while also giving you advantage, means it's a little bit too broken to be released from the ban list without some kind of change. And at number 7, we have Last Will. This is a card that basically lets you special summon any monster from your deck, as long as it has 1,500 or less attack. As its requirements to be activated are so easy to use in pretty much every deck, it might as well not even be there, as you just need to have 1 monster in your side of the field be sent to the graveyard that turn. So, being able to special summon any monster from your deck with under 1,500 attack on a spell card that's not once per turn is generally good for 2 reasons. 1, it's basically a search from your deck of an incredibly large range of monsters, as there's lots of good combo pieces with less than 1,500 attack. And for 2, it brings the card directly to the field, which opens up a whole bunch of more combo pieces, where generally there is really good low attack monsters that work great as combo pieces, but they can't special summon themselves, so they're not played as often. And Last Will kind of eliminates those restrictions from those kinds of cards and makes them even more playable. Currently, there's a meta deck that performs incredibly well because it has a whole bunch of low attack combo pieces that they would absolutely love to special summon directly from the deck, as they could even play stuff like Where Art Thou and Sandgan to search them out. Two cards that allow you to search out low attack, low level monsters with much harder activation requirements than Last Will. And those cards only add those monsters to the hand. Basically, Last Will is one of those cards that has such a simple effect to understand that just happens to be incredibly powerful in the current metagame, but wasn't a big deal when it first came out. So it would absolutely see lots of play if it was unbanned, especially if it was unlimited, as you could use multiple Last Wills in the same turn. And at number 6, we have Painful Choice. This is a spell card which allows you to select 5 cards from your deck and then show them to your opponent, in which case your opponent gets to choose 1 card among them to add to your hand, while the remaining 4 cards get sent to the graveyard. Currently, there is a card in the game called Foolish Burial, which only allows you to send 1 monster from your deck to the graveyard, and that's it. And that card is so good that it's currently limited to 1 copy per deck. There's also an Exceeds monster called Lavolval Chain, who has the effect to send any 1 card from your deck to the graveyard, and is currently banned because that effect is too good on a generic rank 4 monster. Painful Choice is 5 times better than both of those cards, as it allows you to get 4 cards in the graveyard while also going hand neutral, as you get one of those cards to your hand. With how most decks use the graveyard as a second hand, this card could potentially allow you to go +5 in card advantage, and is an incredibly powerful spell card which will never be unbanned, unless they get rid of like all graveyard effects, or make it so you banish these cards face down after using it rather than sending them to the graveyard, in which case it would still probably be pretty decent. And at number 5, we have Spellbook of Judgment. Now, this will be the only archetype-specific card on this list, and it makes this list for having one of the strongest effects in the game. That just happens to be tied to an archetype, where during the end phase of the turn, you can add Spellbook spell cards from your deck to your hand up to the number of spell cards you activated that turn, and then special summon any 1 spellcaster-type monster from your deck who has a level less than the number of cards you added to your hand. So, for example, if you activated 6 spell cards after using Spellbook of Judgment, you'd be able to add 6 cards to your hand during the end phase. Then special summon a spellcaster-type monster who was level 6 or lower. So generally, when they have 1 card that can allow you to go +7 in card advantage, it tends to get banned rather quickly, which was the case with Spellbook of Judgment, especially since a lot of the Spellbook cards were good on their own, so it was allowing you to add good cards to your hand and not just a whole bunch of bad ones. But since this card is restrictive to a single archetype, and you do only get the cards during your end phase, so it's not like you get to use them immediately, I kind of put it at the middle of this list, since, yeah, sure, it is one of the strongest archetype-specific cards in the game, but the next 4 spots would see more play in more decks, which is kind of why they're taking higher spots, even if some of them aren't, strictly speaking, as broken as Spellbook of Judgment, or even Painful Choice for that matter. And at number 4, we have Card of Safe Return. This is a card that lets you draw 1 card each time a monster is special summoned from the graveyard. There are a lot of archetypes that special summon monsters from the graveyard and gain a whole bunch of advantage while doing it. So this card would give all of those archetypes so much more advantage that they would instantly become tier 0, probably, assuming they could search this card out. There aren't too many good ways to get continuous spell cards out of your deck to your hand on your first turn. But if the only limiting factor to a card being broken and completely meta-defining is whether or not you can get it to your opening hand, I'd say that's reason enough to still call this card broken anyway. And funny enough, this incredibly strong card that could probably never be unbanned without an errata is the weakened version of this card from the anime. As in the anime, this card allowed you to draw 3 cards each time you special summon from the graveyard instead of just 1 card, which is why the card artwork has 3 cards in it, which would be a little bit bonkers in power levels, as you already gained so much advantage from just drawing 1 card, especially since there's a couple of ways to draw every single card in your deck with this card. Being able to draw 3 cards would just let you do that faster. So basically, this card would always stay banned because it allows already good decks to be even better, and allows you to draw every single card in your deck pretty easily in a lot of different ways. And they could probably change all of this by just making it once per turn, similar to cards like Supply Squad. And at number 3, we have Pot of Greed, a card which is so powerful that many people don't even know what it does. But basically, what this card does is it's like a slightly stronger version of Pot of Desires, or Pot of Extravagance, where with Pot of Desires, you have to banish the top 10 cards of your deck face down in order to draw 2 cards, which can only be used once per turn. And Pot of Extravagance requires you to banish 6 random cards from your extra deck face down in order to draw 2 cards, and it can only be used once per turn, and locks you out of drawing any other cards for the rest of the turn by card effects. Pot of Greed allows you to do the effects of these 2 heavily played cards without any of the drawbacks, costs, or side effects. And if Pot of Desires and Pot of Extravagance see tons of competitive play in many kinds of different decks, I could assume Pot of Greed would see even more play and just be in pretty much every single deck ever. So if there's already restrictions on lesser versions of this card, like Pot of Avarice, which is currently limited to 1 copy, then there's no way they would unban the costless version, which is just an easy +1 that's only a soft once per turn. And at number 2, we have Graceful Charity, which just allows you to draw 3 cards and then discard 2. Technically, Graceful Charity isn't even a +1 in card advantage, and is only hand neutral, as you're basically trading in 3 cards for just 3 cards from your deck, if you remember to count Graceful Charity as one of those cards you're losing from your hand. And here's the thing about Graceful Charity. It allows you to set up your graveyard in one of the best possible ways, by drawing cards and choosing which cards in your hand get to go to the graveyard for yourself. For most meta decks, the graveyard can be seen as a second hand, since there are so many graveyard effects in the game that allow you to gain resources from the graveyard. Like I said in the painful choice part. Like how Salamangrates have a whole bunch of cards that can special summon themselves from the graveyard, or how Destiny Hero Malicious can allow you to go +2 from its graveyard effect. And then there's the whole thing with Orcus cards being able to do everything with their graveyard effects. I personally think Graceful Charity would be far stronger than Pot of Greed if they were to return either of these 2 cards to the game, because it allows you to set up your graveyard better while also choosing which cards you want to keep in your hand, as most decks play lots of hand traps as well, that they absolutely want to keep in their hand, and not randomly go to the graveyard like what would happen with some other mill type cards. And hand neutral cards themselves are heavily restricted in the game as well. Upstart Goblin and Into the Void are both hand neutral cards, by only letting you draw 1 card and have side effects for doing that, and they're both limited to 1 copy per deck. Chicken Game is also a hand neutral card which is currently banned, because being able to cycle through your deck while not losing advantage basically allows you to play with a smaller deck. The reason Upstart Goblin is limited is because if you could play 3 Upstart Goblins, it was the same as playing a 27 card deck, which meant you could get your actual combo pieces out more consistently. So playing 3 Graceful Charities would be almost equivalent to playing a 31 card deck, since it allows you to draw more cards while being hand neutral, and setting up your graveyard. And that kind of consistency would be good in pretty much every meta deck, which is why I think it's a slightly better option than Pot of Greed, which is also good in every deck as well. I just think the graveyard setup of Graceful Charity while digging through your deck is just a little bit better. And at number 1, we have Makura the Destructor. Probably the most broken card that's currently banned, because it absolutely changes the balance of the game when you resolve its effect. This card's effect is pretty simple, and is also only 1 sentence long, where during the turn this card is sent to the graveyard, you can activate trap cards from your hand. Now, trap cards are balanced around the fact that they need to be set for a turn before you can activate them, which is why cards like Jar of Greed, a trap card that lets you draw 1 card, is unlimited and sees no competitive play. Whereas cards like Upstart Goblin, with the same exact effect and even having a downside to using it, is limited to 1 copy per deck for being too good. Because having to set Jar of Greed first then wait a turn means you can't use it as a combo piece during your first turn in order to go into a whole bunch of combo plays, and kind of ruins the whole point of the card of extending combo pieces by drawing cards if you have to wait a turn before you can use it. Not to say Jar of Greed is bad, it's just a bit too slow to really accomplish what Upstart Goblin can, and Makura the Destructor turns it into a better Upstart Goblin. Makura also turns every counter trap card into a red reboot, where you can just activate them from your hand whenever you want to negate whatever you want. It also allows you to activate continuous trap cards from your hand. So if you're able to return Call of the Haunted to your hand, you can just activate it again from your hand during the battle phase, since it is a spell speed 2 card if it's in your hand and you're able to play it from your hand, since it's still a trap card, and then inflict an infinite amount of battle damage to your opponent if you return it to your hand with cards like Chick the Yellow. And since Makura can activate its effect no matter how it's sent to the graveyard, you can just mill it straight from your deck to the graveyard with a Foolish Burial or an Armageddon Knight in order to break the rules of the game for a turn, and possibly draw every single card from your deck, or attack for an infinite amount of battle damage, or just inflict a whole bunch of effect damage to your opponent. There are so many ways to take advantage of Makura's effect that they would have to ban like half the trap cards in the game if they wanted to unban Makura the Destructor, which is very unlikely. So instead, they would definitely have to change this card in maybe the same way they changed Temple of the Kings. That card had the effect where you could activate trap cards the turn they were set. It wasn't as powerful as Makura, but it was still incredibly broken. So they changed the card so that you can only activate one trap card per turn the turn it was set, which definitely made the card no longer broken, and they were able to unban it, which is what they would probably have to do with Makura as well. Just change it to activating one trap card from your hand that turn, as part of the reason Makura is so strong is in its ability to activate a whole bunch of trap cards from your hand. Although, there are even some trap cards that could still allow you to win on your first turn if you can only activate one from your hand, like Chain Material for example, or Pre-Errata Exchange of the Spirit. So, even that might not be enough, but in its current form, it's too broken to ever come back to the game, and I'm confident they'll never unban this card without an errata. Just a little over 3 years ago, we looked at 10 cards that could never come off the ban list without some kind of errata. And within those years, only 2 cards from that list have been freed. Spell of Good Judgment with no changes and is now limited, and Makura is at 3 with its new errata. However, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list contains a lot more than just 10 cards that can never be unbanned. So today we're going to look at 10 more cards that will never come off the list without some kind of change, why they were banned in the first place, and why they couldn't come off today. And growing into number 10, we have Fiber Jar, a level 3 flip monster belonging to the Jar series of monsters, and the only flip monster in the game that's currently banned now that Cyber Jar has come to 1. However, Fiber Jar isn't banned because its effect is good. It's just because it's annoying. Because when Fiber Jar is flipped face up, both players shuffle every card from their hand, field, and graveyard back into the deck and then draw 5 cards, essentially resetting the duel back to the first turn, wiping both players' fields and graveyards of resources. Back in 2004, this effect was quite strong as it could be used to clear away your opponent's field in a format where removal options weren't as available. And it being a flip monster didn't matter as much because it was likely your opponent was going to try to beat over it by battle. So if you were losing a duel while your opponent had overextended into a lot of powerful boss monsters, or had a bunch of back row, you could set Fiber Jar to reset their advantage back to the beginning of the duel so you'd have a fighting chance. But even back in 2004, where this effect was strong, it wasn't the reason why it was banned. It was instead because it was capable of stalling out a duel for way longer than it needed to be. Now, there are plenty of stall and stun tools that exist that can slow the game down to a crawl, but these cards usually advance the game state in some way, either by restricting your opponent or by interrupting their plays. In the case of Fiber Jar, it doesn't advance the game state at all, and stalls in an unproductive way where both players have to basically play out the entire duel again. This is a nightmare for Yu-Gi-Oh! Events, as now duels that would have only lasted 15 or 20 minutes end up lasting double the amount of time after Fiber Jar has resolved. Now, in the modern era, it's a lot less likely that Fiber Jar is ever going to have a chance to resolve. It being a flip monster makes it incredibly vulnerable to removal, and it's likely your opponent is going to have a negate up in the battle phase, so if it were unbanned, it likely wouldn't be having the same stalling capabilities it did back in the day. But with cards like Self-Destruct Button banned in the TCG, it's been made pretty clear that cards that are designed to stall at matches for no reason are mostly looked down upon. So even though Fiber Jar is pretty bad when compared to most other cards in the ban list, it's not likely to come off anytime soon. Overall, Fiber Jar isn't a very good card in the modern day, but its ability to stall at games and make duels and events really annoying makes it a permanent feature on the ban list that probably won't ever be coming back without changing how the card works entirely. And at number 9, we have the Forceful Sentry, a normal spell card with a simple but devastatingly powerful hand rip effect. Whenever you activate Forceful Sentry, you get to look at your opponent's hand and choose one card from it to shuffle back into their deck. In part 1, we talked about how strong cards that discard from your opponent's hand are, and why cards like Delinquent Duo, Trap Dust Shoot, and Gunblard Dragon are all on the ban list, because every one of these cards has the potential of sniping out your opponent's best playmakers before they have the opportunity to use them. And Sentry is one of the strongest hand ripping effects ever printed, because you actually get to look at your opponent's hand and then choose what card you want to shuffle back into the deck, instead of it being random like with Duo. Even back when it was first released, this was crazy because it gave you free hand knowledge while also allowing you to shuffle back your opponent's best cards. So if you saw that they had a Blackluster Soldier, you could put it back while also get an idea about how they're going to be playing in future turns, or if they had any powerful trap cards that you can now play around. And this effect is even stronger now than it was back then. You see, a huge part of what makes modern Yu-Gi-Oh so interesting is playing around what could be in your opponent's hand. You could choose to play around Ash Blossom but still lose in Nibiru, or you could build a smaller board so evenly matched doesn't hurt as much, but still lose to a Kaiju. But if Forceful Sentry was legal, you could just immediately activate to scout out your opponent's hand and shuffle back whatever interruption or board breakers they might have, while also gaining knowledge about their hand and what deck they're on, allowing you to build your board to counter exactly what you know they have. Now, technically speaking, this effect is legal in the modern format, since Triple Tactics Talents, a card designed to mirror 3 banned cards at once, can be used just like Sentry to shuffle back a card in your opponent's hand while also gaining free information. But the difference between Sentry and Talents is that in order to use Talents, your opponent has to have used a monster effect during the main phase, giving them a chance to hand trap you before you look at their hand, and if they don't hand trap you or activate any monster effects, it's basically just a dead card in hand. Sentry doesn't have the same kind of restriction, meaning that you can just use it to scout out your opponent's hand and shuffle back the best card before you combo off. But even with the restrictions that Talent has, its Sentry mode is game-winningly strong, and sometimes feels almost ban-worthy itself, which is why there's no way that Sentry, a card without the same restrictions as Talents, is not coming off the ban list anytime soon. And climbing into number 8, we have Level Eater, a level 1 insect monster that wasn't broken at first, but became so after the advent of Link monsters. Like a lot of other banned cards, Level Eater's effect is deceptively simple, because whenever it's in the graveyard, you can reduce the level of a level 5 or higher monster you control by 1 to special summon Level Eater from the graveyard. But while you control it, it can't be tributed for anything other than a tribute summon. Something you might have missed about this effect is that it doesn't have any kind of once per turn on it, making it so that while you control any high level monster, Level Eater represents a ton of material that can be used for extra deck summons. And for a while, this made Level Eater a really strong, but not yet broken, combo piece in a lot of synchro focused strategies that would flood the board with a bunch of high level synchro monsters, while also valuing the free materials that Level Eater provided. The thing that pushed Level Eater over the edge, though, was the subsequent release of Link monsters, and more specifically, the release of Link Karibo. Link monsters meant that a ton of material that Level Eater represented could actually be put to good use and gave you a lot of insanely strong payoffs. And all of this was enabled because of Link Karibo's printing, which gave you an easy way to instantly put your Level Eater in the graveyard. This was already insanely strong back in 2018. And since then, the variety of Link boss monsters and their strength has increased dramatically, and now there's some absolutely insane Link payoffs available to any deck playing Level Eater. There's Appaloosa, which is both an amazing end board piece and a negate for whatever hand trap your opponent might have, Saryuja to dig deeper into your deck and extend your plays even further, or just Borosword and Access Code in case you need to OTK your opponent. In general, while there might have been an era where Level Eater could just exist as a strong card, we're well beyond that point now. And with the Link payoffs that are available in the game, as well as a number of ways that Level Eater can easily be put into the graveyard, there's a low chance of it ever coming back. And shocking nobody at number 7 is number 16, Shockmaster, an extra deck payoff that can lock your opponent out of the game entirely. Because with Shockmaster, you can detach a material and call a type of card between monster, spell, and trap. If you call spell or trap, your opponent won't be able to activate that type of card you called until the end of the next turn. And if you call monster, they won't be able to activate monster effects for the same duration. Now, it does require a lot of investment to go into, since in order to summon out Shockmaster, you need to commit 3 level 4 bodies to the board. For a while, this high investment was too much for most decks, so in its early days, Shockmaster didn't see too much competitive play. However, Shockmaster was honestly just waiting to be broken wide open. Because even though it requires a decent amount of monsters to go into, stunning your opponent out of an entire card type for their turn is game-winning by itself. So once decks like Windup could consistently get to Shockmaster, the card began to see near instant success because even just a single Shockmaster activation could stop your opponent from playing entirely depending on their deck. And because Shockmaster's effect is a soft once per turn, you could even make multiple Shockmasters stop your opponent from activating any card type, forcing them to pass without doing anything. And in the modern game, Shockmaster would have even more utility, because it's not only just good to stop your opponent's turn, it's also good at stopping their hand traps during your turn. So if you make Shockmaster early in your combo, you could guarantee that your opponent is never going to hit you with an Effect Veiler or Droll while you pop off, which incidentally allows for decks to make nearly unbreakable boards, or sometimes just straight up FTK without fear of having their field tributed. And in the modern game, making Shockmaster isn't really that much of a difficult task anymore, as there are now better and more extenders available that allow you to swarm the field with a ton of level 4 bodies. Overall, Shockmaster is far too strong to ever come off the list with how fast the modern game is. It's not that hard to make anymore, and because of the speed of the current meta, you could just OTK your opponent after they're forced to pass turn without doing anything. So now definitely isn't the right time to unlock the Shock. And leading the charge at number 6 is Soul Charge, a reborn spell so good that it even managed to power creep Monster Reborn. You see, while Monster Reborn can let you summon out any monster from the graveyards, Soul Charge will let you summon up to 5 at once. However, unlike Reborn, Soul Charge actually comes with drawbacks. Its first is that for every monster you summon with Soul Charge, you lose 1000 life points. So if you summon one monster, you only lose 1000 life points. But if you summon 5, you lose 5000. The second drawback is that you're locked out of the battle phase entirely during the turn you use Soul Charge, putting a stop to any OTK potential with the card. The thing about these drawbacks though, is that they don't do anything to balance out the card and are relatively minor in comparison to the payoff that summoning 5 monsters from your graveyard is. You see, in general, reborn effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are some of the strongest types of extension in the game, and allow you to use the cards in your graveyard as an extra resource, summoning them back out to either use their on-field effects or just as free bodies for extra deck plays. And these effects being so strong is a big reason why cards like Premature Burial and Monster Reborn are both on the Forbidden and Limited list. And in the case of Soul Charge, it doesn't just summon back one monster, it can summon 5. This made the card absolutely amazing during the time it was legal, as long as you had some way to see the graveyard by either using monsters as materials or extra deck plays, or just by filling it up over the course of a duel. Even in cases where you couldn't put 5 monsters in the grave, Soul Charge was, at worst, a Monster Reborn that you had to pay 1000 life points for, which is still a great effect. And when Link monsters were introduced, Soul Charge was even more busted. Suddenly, it became easier than ever to fill your graveyard with a bunch of monsters while you climbed into powerful Link bosses. And then, once you finish with your main combo, you could just summon out another 5 monsters with Soul Charge to turn a strong board into an unbreakable one. But even without Link monsters, Soul Charge would be overpowered if it ever came back and would likely see play in almost every strategy, since it basically allows a pendulum summon from the graveyard for almost no cost. It's honestly a wonder how Soul Charge even got printed in the first place, as even back when it first came out, it was an astonishingly strong card that even managed to match the strength of old GOAT staples like Pot of Greed and Painful Choice. And powering in at number 5 is Red Reboot, the only counter trap that's currently on the ban list, and for good reason, because Reboot is capable of shutting down a ton of trap-based strategies and winning the game all on its own. You can only activate Reboot whenever your opponent activates a trap card, and it allows you to negate the activation of that trap card and set it back face down. But then your opponent gets a chance to set any other trap card they want from their deck. However, they won't be able to use it on the turn to use Reboot, because for the rest of the turn after Reboot resolves, your opponent can't activate trap cards at all. Both of these effects are quite strong. But if Red Reboot were a regular trap card, it's likely that it never would have seen that much competitive play. But Reboot isn't like a regular trap card, because you don't need to set it to use its effect, because by paying half your life points, you can activate Red Reboot directly from your hand. This made Reboot an absolutely wild card for combo-based strategies when facing any kind of trap deck. Because into a board of a ton of trap cards, drawing Reboot meant that your opponent had basically no way of interacting with your combo, because the moment they activated any trap card, you could just chain Reboot to lock them out of their entire field, making it an insane counter to your opponent's potential floodgates, removal, and interaction, all from a single card, making it very similar to another banned card, Cold Wave. But Red Reboot is arguably even better than Cold Wave because it's a counter trap. This makes it incredibly difficult to interact with, since both players can only respond to it with another counter trap card. So unless your opponent has a Solemn Judgment set, they just can't even chain their other set cards to it. Now, technically speaking, Reboot does have a huge downside where your opponent gets to set any trap card they want from their deck, allowing them to grab vital engine pieces or floodgates. So if they make it back to their turn, your opponent actually is in a really solid spot. But that's only if they make it back to their turn with their field in one piece, because when your opponent is under Red Reboot, nothing is stopping you from clearing away their field with something like Zeus, or just OTKing your opponent outright for a win. Trap decks have a lot of hate targeted towards them already. But even in spite of that, a ton of trap strategies are still really playable in the modern era, with some of the best decks of the current format relying almost entirely on trap cards. With Reboot at 3, most trap decks are going to be pushed out of the game entirely, since the card has almost zero counterplay, and even if it only came back to 1, like it was previously, it would be a very sacky one-of that every combo strategy would play in their sides just for the chance of stealing a free game from control decks. The likes of Evenly Matched and Lightning Storm are also great counters against trap decks, but Red Reboot is the ultimate counter, and one that floodgates your opponent out of interacting with you entirely. It would make it a lot harder for trap decks to see competitive success. And summoning into number 4 is Summon Sorceress, one of the earliest truly broken Link monsters. Summon Sorceress is a Link 3 monster that can be made using at least 2 monsters of the same type, other than tokens, and comes with 2 effects. When you Link summon it, you can special summon a monster from your hand to your opponent's field to a zone where Sorceress points to. But its main effect, and the reason why it's banned, is its second effect, as it allows you to target a monster that Summon Sorceress points to, and special summon a monster from your deck with the same type as that monster to another zone that Summon Sorceress points to, but its effects are negated. Even if the effects of the monster you summon are negated, having the potential to special summon any monster from the deck is amazing, because not only was it a great way to extend into another busted Link monster like Firewall Dragon, it was also a way to basically foolish monsters for powerful graveyard effects after linking them off, because even though their on-field effects are negated, their graveyard effects were fair game. So Summon Sorceress was using a ton of different strategies to search out a variety of different monsters from the deck, depending on the strategy you were playing. World Chalice would send Eva to get 2 free fairy monsters from the deck to the hand after it hits the graveyard. ABC decks would often summon out their missing ABC piece so they could eventually go into Dragon Buster. And the best part was the effect was incredibly easy to use. You had the option of summoning out a monster from your hand to your opponent's field in a pinch, but because Summon Sorceress has 2 downward facing arrows, you could just summon a monster to one of her arrows and then use the effect to summon out another monster from your deck to the other downward pointing arrow. And because it was so easily usable, just about every deck that could play Summon Sorceress did, which is why it was banned. And if it came back today, every deck would do the same. Summoning nearly any monster from the deck is just too powerful an effect not to be abused in some way. In fact, Halki-Fibrax, a card similar to Summon Sorceress that was only capable of summoning level 3 or lower tuner monsters, was also banned for having too many potential options it could summon from the deck. And Summon Sorceress has even more options than Halki-Fibrax, as it can pull pretty much every single other monster in the game. Any card that can summon monsters from the deck is going to be useful in some capacity or another, and Summon Sorceress might just be one of the best ways to summon a monster from the deck ever printed. Being an accessible extra deck monster with a superbly easy to use effect that can summon just about anything, so it's pretty safe to say it's never coming off the ban list. And sitting on its throne at number 3 is Imperial Order, a floodgate that was capable of shutting down every spell card of the game by itself. Because while Imperial Order is face up on the field, all spell effects are negated. But during each standby phase, there is a mandatory cost of 700 life points that you have to pay, otherwise Imperial Order destroys itself. Out of the 3 main card types in the game, spell cards are the most powerful since they're instantly usable and have fairly low cost commit when compared to monster and trap cards. And the sheer variety of spell effects has led to hundreds, if not thousands, of different strategies relying on spell cards for their plays in some way or another. Some decks use spells for extension, others will instead use them for consistency, and some might even use them as going second tools. And because so many decks in the game are reliant on spell cards in some capacity, Imperial Order was a powerhouse of a card. Because most of the ways to deal with floodgates are with spell cards, so it was actually really difficult to out since it would just negate the effects of your Harpy's Feather Duster and Lightning Storm if you ever tried to activate them. This made Imperial Order one of the craziest going first tools in the game, since because it was a trap card, you could combo off during your turn and use all of your powerful spell cards to pop off. But after you built up your board and passed to your opponent, you can then flip over Order to lock them out of their spell cards before they get a chance to play. And all of this is for a relatively negligible cost of 700 life points per standby phase, which basically means nothing if you're winning on turn 3 of the duel anyway. And what's even more wild is that Imperial Order used to be even stronger, because its maintenance cost in 2003 wasn't mandatory. So you can lock your opponent out of their turn for the best spells, then just choose not to pay Order's cost during your standby phase so it destroys itself so that you could use your spell cards again. This led to Imperial Order being banned up until it received its modern errata, which made its cost mandatory rather than a choice. But this wasn't enough to keep Imperial Order balanced, especially not in the modern form, and as soon as it was legalized with its errata, Imperial Order saw instant competitive success as one of the most absurd going first tools available, and that virtually guaranteed a win. And this made it so that Imperial Order, even with its errata, ended up being banned for a second time in 2022. Now, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is no stranger to strong going first traps put in the side decks of combo strategies to ensure a victory. Cards like Super Ancient Organism and Rival of the Warlords fluctuate in viability depending on the current meta, and Imperial Order even has a weaker version of itself that sees a ton of play in side decks because of its ability to shut down spell cards for just one turn. But Order is one of the strongest of these tools, and while it and Anti-Spell Fragrance do similar things, you have to flip up Anti-Spell Fragrance before your opponent uses a spell card to stop them. But with Order, it can be reactive, activating it in response to your opponent's playmakers to negate their effects and make them waste a resource in the process. Imperial Order was often a frustrating card to face. It floodgated you out of the game and even protected itself from its own outs. It was so powerful they had to ban it twice even with its errata. And at number 2 on this list, we have Magical Scientist, one of the oldest cards on the ban list and one that was responsible for one of Yu-Gi-Oh's first consistent FTK strategies. With Magical Scientist, you can pay 1000 life points to special summon out any level 6 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck, but that monster can't declare direct attack and it's returned to the extra deck during the end phase. The key thing to note about this effect though, is that it doesn't come with any kind of once per turn. So as long as you can afford the life point cost, you can flood the field with a ton of fusion monsters for basically free. Now, back during the time when Magical Scientist first came out, before Links, Xyz, or even Synchro monsters, there wasn't much that you could actually do with the free bodies that Scientist summons out, especially since there were fewer options for good fusion monsters to summon, and Scientist's restrictions made it so you couldn't really use it to OTK. But you could FTK instead with the effect of Catapult Turtle. Catapult Turtle's effect allows you to tribute a monster you control to deal damage to your opponent equal to half that monster's attack, and in the modern era, Catapult has a soft once per turn. But back then, the effect actually had no restriction on how many times you could use it per turn. So if you could swarm the field with a ton of high attack monsters to tribute, you could just burn your opponent for 8,000 life points on your first turn. And that's exactly what Magical Scientist provided. And even though you had to pay life points each time you used Scientist by tributing enough fusion monsters, as well as Scientist and Catapult Turtle, you got to win on your first turn by burning for exactly 8,000 points of damage. But since then, Catapult Turtle has gotten errata, making it a soft once per turn, so you can only use it once per turn, per copy, and you'd have to resummon it out again if you wanted to burn your opponent's life points twice or more, making this FTK a lot less consistent in theory. But that still doesn't mean Scientists can come back in the modern era. While it may not be used for Catapult Turtle FTKs anymore, there's a lot more things you can do with the free bodies that it provides now. For starters, there are now a lot more really strong level 6 or lower fusion monsters compared to back when Scientists first got access to them. The cards you're summoning out are no longer vanillas with high attack stats, they're cards like Mudragna the Swamp with insane on-field effects, or even El Shaddai App Cologne for its powerful graveyard effect. But that's not all, because Scientists doesn't just allow you to use it for powerful fusion plays. As with the bodies you summon, you can now easily access a ton of different Synchros, Xyz, and Link plays, all from a single Magical Scientist on field. Magical Scientist is one of the most broken monsters in the game, and it's interesting to think about all the reasons why it was banned back then, and the context of the modern game that keeps it banned to this day. But one thing is for certain, summoning a bunch of bodies has always been an overpowered effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! There's no way that Scientists can ever come off the list. Its effect is just too strong for so little investment, and even cards that have tried to act as weaker versions of Scientists like Instant Fusion have still found themselves on the Forbidden Limited list in some way or another. And crawling into the number 1 spot is Maxx C, one of the most controversial cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history and the most powerful hand trap ever printed. You see, Maxx C has an easy to understand but absurd effect. On a hard once per turn and a quick effect speed, you can send Maxx C from your hand to the graveyard to make it so that during this turn, whenever your opponent special summons a monster, you get to draw 1 card. Now, if you play Master Duel the OCG, you might be surprised to see Maxx C on this list at all, let alone at number 1 spot because it's actually at 3 in both of these formats. But in the TCG, Maxx C has been banned since 2018, and it's one of the defining differences between the TCG and the other mainline formats, because the legality of Maxx C changes how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played just because of how centralizing it is as a staple. While in the TCG, you can build your deck to be a lot greedier and more focused on extension, meta decks in the OCG and Master Duel need to be built with Maxx C in mind, because whenever Maxx C has resolved, you're left with a really difficult choice. You can stop special summoning entirely so that your opponent doesn't get any draws, but you end on a board of basically nothing. Or you could instead accept the Maxx C challenge and continue going for a board filled with a ton of interaction, while giving your opponent a lot of free cards while just hoping they don't draw the outs or hand traps they need to stop you. Or you could just build a small board, giving your opponent only a couple of free cards in the hand, but still ending on some kind of interruption. And for a lot of players, this appears more like a lose-lose scenario, as you have to gamble on the correct choice every time Maxx C is activated. And the correct choice is often based on an unknown information, like what your opponent is playing, whether or not they're on other hand traps, and what cards are already in their hand. In fact, Maxx C is so format warping that most decks in these formats are forced to play a ton of different Maxx C counters that they have to use to stop their opponent from getting free draws. From Called by the Grave to Crossout Designator and even Ash Blossom and Gamma, these cards are strong in their own right, but their ability to stop Maxx C makes them even stronger in Maxx C formats, warping not just the game, but your deck building choices around it as well. The TCG, however, is a whole different game because deck builders and pilots don't need to worry about their turn being stopped by what many consider an unfair floodgate, so you'll often see stark differences in how decks are built between the 3 formats. Choices that make complete sense in the TCG might be wrong for the OCG, and a deck that is meta in Master Duel might not fully translate over to the TCG. This doesn't make one format better than the other, but it does make them different. If Maxx C were to come back to the TCG, the way people play Yu-Gi-Oh! Would change forever, and a lot of modern deck building theory would need to be revised and altered purely around the card's presence. And to a lot of people, that anti-Maxx C way of playing the game, constantly hoping you have a counter for the card, just isn't fun. But whether or not you're pro or anti-Maxx C, both sides can agree that the card shapes the metagame around it, and is one of the most important cards for defining the differences between the OCG and the TCG formats. And so long as these different formats exist, it's really unlikely that Maxx C ever returns to the TCG or is banned in the OCG, because it creates a divide between the formats that allows for different ways to play the game to suit different audiences. Due to not having a set rotation, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game where cards are just as likely to become broken due to some new crazy interaction as they are to becoming power crept instead. In this video, we're going to go over cards which used to be banned until the game's pace caught up and allowed them to leave the forbidden list. Starting us off at number 10, we have Yata-Garasu. This is a level 2 Fiend Spirit monster with 200 attack and 100 defense. It has the usual Spirit monster effects where it cannot be special summoned and returns to the hand at the end phase. And it has the effect where if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they skip their next draw phase. Yata-Garasu got banned because of interacting with another card that was so broken it needed to be errata to come back into the game, Chaos Emperor Dragon and Void of the End. If you activate Chaos Emperor Dragon's effect while having Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest on the field, you'd wipe the whole field and then search Yada to lock your opponent out of their draw phase with 0 cards in hand. This terrifying combo was the main play Chaos decks of old wanted to execute, which they could do with crazy consistency due to all the consistency spells legal at the time. The existence of this tier 1 deck back in the day was actually the main reason why they started banning cards out of the game entirely with the Forbidden List, instead of just limiting them. Yada was certainly the weakest part of that 3-card combo, yet it was the piece that stayed in the list for the longest time. Though, to be fair, the others all only ever came off the ban list due to receiving mechanical erratas. This card was kept on the ban list for almost 20 years, alongside the other draw-denying card, Time Seal, but they were almost certainly only there to be made an example of more than anything else. The heavy restrictions of spirit monsters stopped all but the most impactful ones from seeing play throughout the years, like Dark Dust Spirit being able to blow up the whole field, or Amano Iwato locking monster effects out entirely. This card wasn't really useful by itself even back in the day, and so of course it saw no play when it finally came off the ban list. And that's why it only makes it the 10th spot on this list. And coming in at number 9, we have Magician of Faith. This is a level 1 flip spellcaster. When flipped up, can target a spell card in your graveyard and add it back to your hand. Magician of Faith was a staple of many early Yu-Gi-Oh formats, where flip monsters were still incredibly prevalent. The most powerful cards in the game at the time were spells, none of which were once per turn. Resolving a Pot of Greed or Premature Burial once could often turn the tables in a duel, and being able to do so twice could easily guarantee a win. Despite Magician of Faith being limited, it could also often be reused with another popular monster at the time, Tsukiyomi, who could set it face down each turn as long as you had a way to protect it. This card was easily searchable from the deck as well through the Apprentice Magician engine, which floats into face down Magician of Faith straight from the deck and was a popular engine for Monarch decks. For all of this, Magician of Faith rightfully earned its slot on the ban list for several years, returning only at the tail end of the Xyz era, and without much fanfare. By then, flip monsters had been mostly phased out of the meta as the game got exponentially faster. The only ones that still saw play were easily searchable and provide more utility and advantage within their own archetypes, such as Gear Gaia Armor getting you a search every turn, or Raikou being removal that also milled cards from the deck. Though this card did manage to see some play sometime later on in a few Chainburn decks as a way to recycle Chain Strike and pots. It's usually not seen as much more than a piece of Yu-Gi-Oh's history nowadays. And at number 8, we have Thousand Eyes Restrict. This is a level 1 Dark Spellcaster fusion monster that requires specifically Relinquished and Thousand Eyes Idol as its materials. It has a floodgate effect where other monsters in the field cannot attack or change their battle positions, and also, once per turn, it can absorb a monster your opponent controls. It gains the stats of the equipped monster and can also destroy it to protect itself from battle destruction. Thousand Eyes was one of the most powerful control tools in early Yu-Gi-Oh! And was a huge part of GOAT format historically, one of the most popular retro formats to this day. Despite requiring 2 really bad monsters as materials, this card had plenty of ways of being cheated out back in the day. The best way to do this was with Metamorphosis tributing any level 1 monster. This could either be spent utility monsters, such as Magician of Faith, or Scapegoat tokens. This interaction with using Scapegoat tokens Metamorphosis to bring out Thousand Eyes is the reason why GOAT format has its name, as the combo was present in most decks for the time. This card would not only act as removal, but also put a total lockdown on the game by freezing attacks and flip monsters, and it could even be reused with Tsukiyomi, just like Magician of Faith. Thousand Eyes Restrict stayed around a decade on the list, and surprisingly, it actually managed to see play once again. While Metamorphosis wasn't legal anymore, Instant Fusion was, and it could cheat this card out without even requiring tribute fodder. Though it wasn't the game-ending threat it once was, it was still a pretty nice piece of removal against your opponent's monsters, which only got better with Link Summoning, as you could absorb an opponent's monster and then link this card off as an extender. And coming in at number 7, we have Cyberstein. This is a level 2 Dark Machine that lets you pay 5,000 life points to special summon any fusion monster from your extra deck in attack position. Cyberstein was part of an extremely powerful OTK strategy in early Yu-Gi-Oh! By bringing out either Cyber End Dragon or Cyber Twin Dragon, you could make up the huge cost by inflicting just as much damage to your opponent, and if you comboed him with either Megamorph or Limit Removal, you'd hit with over 8,000 points of damage instead. There were multiple ways to get Stein, since you could bring it out from the deck with either Last Will or Mystic Tomato. These decks would often max out on ways to get their combos through, since Cyberstein could really only be activated once per duel, so they'd often play cards like Cold Wave, Giant Trunade, and even Royal Decree to stop any pesky back row from getting in the way. There just wasn't enough counterplay to the strategy, especially when coupled with the previous tech cards, which turned this into not only one of the first OTK strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also the first to get an emergency ban list for itself after it took over Attorney. Cyberstein would then remain banned for several years, only being allowed back at 1 copy when the game was well into the Link era. In theory, this card could only get better with years as stronger and stronger fusion monsters would be released, like Nature Exterio, which can lock your opponent out of all spell and traps by itself. And also, life points mattered a lot less as a resource than ever before. But on the other hand, needing extra deck slots for this hard to search out monster with no special summon condition was a hard sell, even if it could in theory win a game by itself. This card was also very notorious in both modern Yu-Gi-Oh video games. In Duel Links, it was used together with a skill that cheated life point cost to bring out Ojama King, which ended the duel by itself due to the fewer zone, locking your opponent out of using any monsters for the game. In Master Duel, it was a centerpiece of one of the infamous bot pilot FTKs that used it to cycle through the effects to copy less independent Nightingale, while cheating the life point cost to kill your opponent on your first turn of the duel. And at number 6, we have Pot of Avarice. This is a normal spell card that requires you to target 5 monsters in your graveyard and then shuffle them all back into your deck to draw 2 cards. Avarice was one of the first stabs Konami took at fixing Pot of Greed by giving it an activation requirement. For the time, needing 5 different monsters in your graveyard was a big enough requirement to balance it somewhat by making it a brick for the first turn of the duel. Still, the format was slow enough to accommodate for this, turning this into an instant staple. Avarice was great as a way for monarchs to reuse their tribute monsters later on in the duel after they were spent, and would only get better with the eventual release of Card Trooper to help accelerate its condition even further. Even back then, this would earn this card its place in the limited list, where it would stay for a couple of years. Pot of Avarice would get much better with the release of Synchro Summoning, as now there were much more reliable ways to fill up your graveyard for that draw too. Popular cards of the time, such as Rescue Cat and Lone Fire Blossom, were very easy ways to get lots of monsters into the graveyard, while also giving you powerful synchros or boss monsters at the same time. This card would eventually be put back on the limited list as more and more ways to quickly get it live were released, until it eventually got banned due to how powerful it became in combo decks like Mermails, which fill up the graveyard effortlessly. Avarice would stay banned before finally being freed at the start of Master Rule 4.5, together with a slew of other changes to the list. By then, despite seeming like the kind of card that would only get better with time, it wasn't strong enough to see play in most decks. There was now plenty of competition in the Draw 2 department, and pretty much only Zodiac and sometimes Sky Striker decks had a really easy time making it live off of a single card, due to how these decks can spam extra deck summons on top of a single monster. And at number 5, we have Raigeki, an extremely iconic normal spell that just destroys all monsters your opponent controls. Raigeki was yet another one of those powerful spells, which were only legal at 1 copy almost since their release, and would become banned as soon as Forbidden List became a thing. A costless mass removal card like this was just too strong for early Yu-Gi-Oh!, where negates came at a high cost, and monsters that floated on any destruction were few and far in between. Even Dark Hole, a strictly worse version of Raigeki outside of a few cases, was seen as too strong to remain in the game at the time, due to how hard it was to get back your board positioning after it resolved. This card would remain on the ban list for several years, and it even got a weaker retrain in Lightning Vortex, which destroyed only face-up monsters for a discard cost, and that was good enough to see play for quite a few years as well. Raigeki would only return to the game in one of the first few sets of the Pendulum era, where it would become a staple in almost every deck again. Even in a meta filled with lots of floaters or protected monsters, Raigeki was still a very powerful tool to punish overextension and push for game on an empty board. Even before it had come off, Dark Hole, which got freed several years before, already saw lots of play for the same reason. They'd both remain quite decent going second tools, and there were even quite a few metas where the top decks were really vulnerable to them. But overall, their value would decrease with years. More and more board-breaking tools slowly broke into the meta, such as Evenly Match being able to banish cards face down from the board instead, or Interrupted Kaiju Slumber giving you a huge beater while also clearing the board. This and the fact that the game would slowly move towards putting more and more negates on the end board turned this previously banned staple into something that only occasionally saw play in side decks, and it's even at 3 nowadays in the TCG. And coming in at number 4, we have Monster Reborn, a normal spell that lets you revive a monster in either player's graveyard. This is one of these cards that has bounced between being limited and banned several times in the game's lifespan. Monster Reborn has always been an incredibly versatile card that wasn't really dead at any point in the duel and would generally put whoever activated in a pretty good spot. In the early formats, you could very easily cheat out high-level monsters into the field to gain control of the match very quickly. The fact that this lets you revive monsters from either graveyard made this even more sacky, as you didn't even need to have seen the card at all throughout the duel to make use of it. So it's no wonder that this card was banned for ages, as even its almost completely worse counterpart, called the Haunted, found itself on the limited list at the time as well. Konami would experiment with just limiting it for a few formats at the time, and most of the times it was this extremely annoying what-of you couldn't really play around, but would see play in almost every deck and would often win the game if top decked at the right time. Just like Called by the Grave is in the TCG these days. That was up until the last time they brought it off the list during the Link era, where the card did see a burst of play due to the novelty of finally being off the ban list, but it's not nearly as omnipresent as it used to be now. The game has just sped up to the point where one free revive isn't enough to completely turn the tides of the duel anymore, and differently from before, it's usually mained to get a free bond in the field for combo plays, and not getting a boss monster back from the graveyard. Monster Reborn is still a very good card, but the pace of the game made it much less of a bomb as it once was, and could probably come back to 3 copies without affecting the meta much, if at all. And coming in at number 3, we have Change of Heart. This spell lets you target a monster your opponent controls and take control of it until the end phase. Monster stealing cards have been some of the most hated staples in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and this is no exception. Change of Heart was another one of those cards that were thought to be perpetually banned with no chance of coming back into the game. Many strictly worse retrains of this card received similar treatments with the years. Snatch Steal was released in a similar time to Change of Heart and is still banned to this day, being freed for just a single format in early 2015, where it became such a sacky card it had to be banned again extremely quickly. Brain Control, the first worst Change of Heart, which added a small life point cost and could only take face-up monsters, had to be limited soon after release and would later be banned as well, only coming back after an errata nerfed it into uselessness. Mind Control didn't let you either tribute or attack with a stolen monster, and also needed to be kept at 1 for most of its lifespan, as it was still consistently great going second card that saw tons of play, especially during toss format when they decided to unrestrict it for a while. With all this said, why is it fine for Change of Heart to exist at 1 then? Well, the quality of going second cards has just gone up tremendously with the years. The cards that actually deal with boards are usually either unrespondable or prevent them from being built up in the first place. Triple Tactics talents can apply the same effect as Change of Heart without ever targeting, and even that card is not a must include in every deck in the meta. So while this is still a pretty good card if you manage to both draw and resolve it, it's just usually less impactful than other sideboard options you might have. And coming in at number 2, we have Harpy's Feather Duster. Another normal spell, this one destroys all spells and traps your opponent controls. Back row removal has been something that has historically been somewhat restricted due to how most interactions used to be present only in spell and traps, especially during your opponent's turn. Feather Duster is probably the strongest single piece of back row removal ever put into the game, so it's no surprise it stayed banned for ages on end. Mystical Space Typhoon only provides a single pop and in itself was limited for a large part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. For a very long time, people only had Heavy Storm as a reliable way to clear out all back row at once, which had the downside of popping your own cards as well, and even that had to be banned at some point. Many clunkier kinds of back row removal ended up seeing play throughout the years, such as Dust Tornado, which was just a strictly worse MST, or Full House, which specifically needed to destroy a mix of face-up and face-downs, and even Malevolent Catastrophe, which needed your opponent to attack to even trigger its effect. However, as time passes and Yu-Gi-Oh! Sped up, Konami began to release more and more busted ways to remove back row. Cosmic Cyclone and then Twin Twisters were two options that were almost objectively better than MST. Some years later, the TCG would finally be blessed with Lightning Storm, which can wipe away your opponent's entire back row as long as you control no face-up cards. It's in this context that Harpy's Feather Duster was released from the ban list, where it's still a very good option to run, but it's not blatantly overpowered compared to other cards we have to deal with spells and traps. Both Twin Twisters and Cosmic are quick play spells, which give them the ability to set as interactions for your opponent's turn, as well as being good outs to anti-spell fragrance, a popular side deck card. While Lightning Storm can wipe out monsters as well, which is occasionally useful if your opponent isn't playing around it or has ended primarily on Link monsters. But even if it isn't the objectively best card you can run for back row anymore, Feather Duster is still a very popular card to out pesky Floodgates, in today's meta anyway, be it in the main or side deck. And at number 1, we have Solemn Judgment, the only counter trap card on this list that can negate and destroy the summon of any monster or activation of any spell or trap card for half your life points. Solemn Judgment is a card with a really interesting history. It's always been a quite busted effect to have on a spell speed 3 effect, but it took a while for people to discover it due to how daunting the life point cost sounded at first. Still, whenever people go back to playing those old formats, you will almost always see Solemn Judgment being played the maximum copies available. Being able to negate your opponent's powerful comeback options, their combo enabler, or even their boss monster summon, all on the same card just gave this card utility like no one other. The cost didn't matter if the loss in tempo and card advantage would make your opponent lose the game turns later anyways, and this is what led to Solemn Judgment getting banned. Even Solemn's weaker retrains in Solemn Strike and Solemn Warning were extremely meta-warping, with the later also earning itself a place on limited lists for several years. With all this said, if there's one card type that time wasn't kind to, it was trap cards. Solemn Judgment was free from the ban list once again in the Link era, where it was still a powerful control tool, but not nearly as overwhelming as it once was. As games are much more likely to be over by turn 2 than ever before, it can become incredibly risky to add cards like this which do nothing when going second to your decks. Nowadays, usually only extremely heavy back row decks are likely to main Solemn Judgment at 3 copies it's available in, and even then it can be risky to play it over other options, as at least Solemn Strike can be comboed with other trap cards such as Torrential Tribute to play into Omni Negates when going second. Still, Solemn remains as one of the best generic trap cards you can run in your side deck, as it's an amazing way to stop all kinds of busted going second cards that are now in the game, and that even includes several other entries on this list. Despite so many retrains and the abundance of archetypal counter-trap negates available these days, Solemn Judgment remains one of the scariest trap cards you can play into the modern metagame. Even when it's a card type that has largely been phased out unless it's activatable from the hand, or a floodgate, Solemn continues to see play, and that's why it makes it to the first slot on this list. The semi-limit list is for cards that can only be at 2 copies in your deck, and has always been the most rarely used one, and in recent years has been mostly reserved as a quarantine zone for previously limited cards. In this list, we're going to go over the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have been semi-limited, but not hit in any other way. And at number 10, we have Emergency Call, a normal spell that lets you add an Elemental Hero monster from your deck to your hand. This card has provided amazing utility over the years due to how big the hero archetype is, letting you search cards like Neos Alias and Gemini Beat decks, and Prisma and Gladiator Beast decks. This card was only semied for around a year from 2012 to 2013. Hero decks were just rogue then, and much, much worse than the actual meta decks from the time. But since all of them got hit to a much bigger degree, Konami probably thought the poor heroes needed a slap on the wrist. Still, this is as minor of a consistency hit as you can get. You just went from having 4 cards that could search heroes to 3, since Rhoda is a limited card that searches pretty much the same cards. E-Call was Hero's best consistency card for years, and is pretty much as good of an archetypal searcher as you can get. However, later on this card would fall off a bit, due to the archetype having even better consistency cards. A Hero Lives, a card that summons out an Elemental Hero for half your life points from your deck instead, would eventually come to compete with E-Call once the game got fast enough for life points not to matter, and for Elemental Heroes with good effects to come out. Nowadays, since the card has recently come back to 3, some hero variants even skip an E-Emergency Call entirely, and this is why this card is only at the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, there's Creature Swap. This is a normal spell that lets each player choose one monster they control and then switches control of those chosen monsters, but they cannot change their battle positions this turn. Creature Swap was actually hit for several years, being on the semi-limit list from 2003 all the way until 2008. Stealing monsters is an effect that has made many cards spend decades on the ban list, so it's not really a surprise this card was at 2 for so long. Letting your opponent choose the monster to give you was usually not that bad of a condition, since you could just use it when the only monster your opponent had was something you'd want to steal. Having to give something to your opponent actually gave this card insane combo potential with some cards. Spirit monsters would trigger their obligatory end phase effects under their opponent's possession, making them come back to your hand after being given. Recruiters like Mystic Tomato that float into other monsters when destroyed by battle could be given to your opponent, and then if you beat over them, they'd trigger in your graveyard and give you another monster from the deck. What's interesting about Creature Swap is that not soon after it was put on the list, Enemy Controller was released, and it was generally seen as the better card. Econ could tribute a monster to take control of an opponent's until the end of the turn as a quick play spell. Despite not letting you keep the monster forever, it ended up seeing way more play than Creature Swap due to the versatility of being a quick play spell, as well as having another effect to change a monster's battle position. Still, some BA decks would choose to play it over Econ anyways. And at number 8, we've got yellow, green, and red gadgets. These 3 cards all have pretty much the same effect, where if they're summoned, they get to search another color from the deck. Green fetches red fetches yellow, and yellow fetches green. The gadgets shook the meta upon release and continue to see play for years afterwards. Normal summons that give you a +1 in card advantage were quite rare at the time, and the good ones were all on the ban list. These cards provided you with that, but for every turn the game went on as long as you still had gadgets in the deck. They put each color to 2 for just a single format ranging from late 2007 to early 2008. Despite it being such a huge hit, since you're much less likely to see your gadgets and their advantage generation was much less, they still kept seeing heavy play at the time. Gadget decks were very good at out-resourcing opponents and always winning on board presence. Because of their small stats, with the biggest one being a green at 1400 attack, these decks would max out on all forms of removal. And because of their typing, they'd pair well with another staple in the format in Cyber Dragon, since they could all be boosted with limiter removal for OTKs. The Infinite Fodder paired along well with Tribute monsters too, making Gadget Monarch a quite popular variant as well. However, they'd soon lose their grip on the meta with the release of new cards leading to more explosive strategies. such as Dark Arm Dragon and Gladiator Beast decks. Still, even if they weren't the best anymore, gadgets remained a very competent engine for years. They got boosted by the Machina cards, since Machina Fortress required machine monsters to be discarded to special summon itself, and extra gadgets were very good to pitch as a cost. Then, during the Xyz era, Tin Goldfish and Kage Tokage were used together with them to spam rank 4s, since these would help you swarm the field with gadgets refilling your hand. And at number 7, we have Archlord Christia. This is a level 8 light fairy monster that prevents either player from special summoning while it's on the field. It can be special summoned from your hand if you have exactly 4 fairies in your graveyard, and when summoned this way you can add a fairy from your graveyard back to your hand. Also, if it would be sent from the field to the graveyard, it gets placed on the top of your deck instead. Christia set himself from the other special summon floodgates on legs at the time, since it actually didn't have any special summon restrictions on itself, letting you cheat him out with cards like Call the Haunted and Reasoning. Still, the reason why they'd eventually put Christia on the ban list was because of the agent support that came out during the early Xyz era. The agents were a series of fairy type monsters that had insane synergy with Christia, since they could fill out the graveyard with fairies. They'd also be able to manipulate the number of fairies in the graveyard with their boss monster, Master Hyperion, which could banish a fairy from the graveyard to pop a card in the field. As if being a 2800 attack Vanity's Emptiness wasn't enough, it would also plus you on summon due to getting a fairy back from your graveyard on summon, letting you make up for the advantage lost by using Herald of Orange Light. The only thing holding Christia back was being an unsearchable boss monster that required setup, and so Konami would semi-limit it together with a couple of other hits to other agent cards to keep the deck in check. It was kept on the list for around 3 years and got himself freed when the strategy wasn't that good anymore. However, decks that could cheat it out easily like Dark Lords and World Chalice would go and use it as their boss monster of choice much later, and it was still as strong as ever. And at number 6 we have Dimensional Prison, a normal trap card that can be flipped when your opponent declares an attack and lets you target and then banish that monster. This card severely power crept Sakuretsu armor on release and saw regular play for years on end. Non-destruction removal has always been highly sought after, and so both D-Prison and Caius the Shadow Monarch dominated early synchro formats. The ability to easily deal with Stardust Dragon, who could negate destroy effects, as well as not letting decks like Black Wings and Lightsworns load the graveyards, was huge. This card only got better as Konami released more and more destruction-proof monsters as the game progressed, such as Dracosack and Silent Honor Arc during the Xyz era. D-Prison got hit in late 2013 in what's still the biggest ban list Yu-Gi-Oh! Had to this day. That list aimed primarily at killing the Dragon Ruler and Spellbook decks that were running the meta at the time by banning all the Baby Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment. Konami also cracked down hard on the best forms of non-destruction removal, limiting Bottomless Trap Hole and Compulsory Evacuation Device, and of course semi-limited Dimensional Prison. This card continued to be used in slower decks as its utility only went up with time. It was one of the best ways to deal with the fire and ice hands which got splashed into a lot of decks back then, as they could wipe out an entire board if you let them to attack into your stronger monsters. Funnily enough, this card's usage dropped off like a cliff at the time it came back to 3. It was still a decent out to monsters with good floating effects, but by then, archetypes generally had pretty good ways at dealing with battle traps before they ever got to the battle phase. And at number 5, we have Light and Darkness Dragon. This is a level 8 light dragon with the following effects. It cannot be special summoned, and it's also treated as dark while face up on the field. Then, once per chain, when a card effect is activated, this card loses exactly 500 attack and defense, and then the activation is negated. At 2800 attack and 2400 defense, it can negate 4 effects while it's face up on the field. Then, if it gets destroyed, it targets its special summons a monster in your graveyard after destroying all of the cards you control. Multiple negates on a monster is usually something you'd only see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But Light and Darkness Dragon lets you stun your opponent like that over a decade and a half ago. Despite the 2 tribute requirement, this card quickly became a mainstay in the meta due to its powerful, non-once per turn negation effect, usually facilitated by the tribute fodder that Treeborn Frog provided. Since the negates were mandatory, this was the card's biggest ally and enemy. A pre-errata Treeborn Frog would trigger as many times as you wished during your standby phase, letting you exhaust a Light and Darkness Dragon's negates without spending any extra resources. The floating effect was the cherry on top, especially at release since another pre-errata card in Destiny Hero Disc Commander comboed really well with that, because when special summoned from the graveyard it let you draw 2 cards without restriction. Light and Darkness Dragon was only legal at 3 for a few months before being semi-limited for 2 formats, then brought back to 3 a couple formats later. This card continued to see play in decks that could easily get out tribute fodder, such as decks that use Dandelion, which would give you 2 tokens when sent to the graveyard. Frog decks would keep using it as their main boss monster by using the aforementioned Treeborn Frog and Ronin Totem. Even Dragon Rulers would try and splash this card in as a game ender, since they generated a ton of advantage and did not need their normal summon. And at number 4, we have Reborn Tengu. a level 4 beast warrior that floats into another copy of itself when it leaves the field. Tengu completely warped the game around it when it was released, being the best kind of recruiter to hit Yu-Gi-Oh so far. It had such an impact that nowadays people refer to the format as Tengu plants, due to the popularity of both itself and Plant Engine played alongside it. Differently from other floaters, Tengu gets its effect when removed from the field in any way, which lets it bypass usual common ways to get around floating effects like banishing. Not only that, but Tengu still triggers if it leaves the field, due to being used for a tribute summon or a synchro summon, so it could be used both offensively and defensively. Tengu got semi-limited first in 2012 and stayed on the list for around 3 years, only being released long after it had lost most of its relevancy. While it was at 3, it saw play either in decks that wanted a lot of value out of their monsters, such as gadgets and TGs, or in combo strategies looking for a way to get lots of material out to make synchros like Trishula. Its popularity fell off as the game progressed, as XC-centric strategies would rise up in the meta, and Tengu itself does not trigger its effect if used as a material for an XC's monster, since these don't count as being on the field. It'd rise up as a tech in early Firefish strategies with the release of Fire Formation Tenki due to being a beast warrior as well. Though the release of more Firefish support and of a better generic Tenki target in Coat Soldier Wolfbark, a 1-card rank 4 would push it out of the meta for good at last. And at number 3, there's Judgment Dragon, the second level 8 light dragon on this list, this time with even higher stats at 3000 attack and 2600 defense. Judgment Dragon must be special summoned by having 4 or more different Lightsworn names in your graveyard, and its effect lets you pay 1000 life points to destroy all other cards in the field, and it also mills 4 cards during each of your end phases. The Lightsworn archetype is comprised of a series of light monsters that either mill cards from your deck, or benefit from being milled themselves. Judgment Dragon was pretty much the first great archetypal boss monster with a huge body and a not once per turn field nuke. There was very little counterplay to this card short of negating its summon at the time it came out, because priority was a thing. You could declare its effect before your opponent could respond with something like a Raigeki break. The only thing that held this card back was how it lacked the Lightsworn name itself, and so it couldn't be searched out with cards like Charge of the Light Brigade. So not only was there not a good way to find it for years, you also had the chance to mill all of your Judgment Dragons before you could draw them. And that's why Lightsworn decks would often play Monster Reincarnation as well. All of this is why Konami decided to give it a little bit of a consistency hit by putting it to 2 copies for around 3 years. Lightsworn decks were still viable and quite good for years on end, despite this and other hits. Shortly after this card was freed from the list in 2011, Konami would release a really good way to search from the deck with Eclipse Wyvern, which also had natural synergy with mill strategies, and so Judgment Dragon continued to see play in Lightsworn variants until those decks were no longer viable. And at number 2, we've got Pot of Duality. This is a normal spell that lets you excavate the top 3 cards of your deck and add one of those cards to your hand on a hard once per turn. Also, you cannot special summon the turn you activate this card. Duality was Konami's second Pot of Greed retrain to warp up the meta, coming at the heels of Pot of Avarice. This card was an extremely expensive staple in release, and for good reason too. Pretty much every deck wanted to play it. The game was slow enough that the restriction wasn't that big of a deal, and even many special summon heavy decks like Blackwings would opt to max it out for the consistency. Duality's presence would only get bigger when Avarice got limited, and then later on banned for years on end. No deck would pass on being able to dig for just the card they needed like that, and so they semi-limited for a couple of formats in 2012 and 2013. But that didn't stop it from being one of the most played staple cards anyway, even as the meta got faster and faster with the release of cards like Soul Charge. Duality always had its place in slower strategies such as Trap Tricks and Bujins, and it even paired well with other consistency cards that saw play then, like Card D and Reckless Greed. That's more or less where the card has been ever since, as it still sees play to this day. Modern decks like Altergeist and Floowandereeze still make use of the card, since it does not conflict with any of the new pot cards that have been released, like Extravagance and Prosperity. Though Duality is still very strong, its restrictions has made it very future-proof, and it's unlikely it'll ever see the list again despite heavy use it sees in decks that don't special summon a lot. And finally, at number 1, we have Destiny Hero Malicious. Malicious is a level 6 Dark Warrior monster with an amazing graveyard effect, where it can banish itself to summon another copy of itself from the deck. This card has been the face of the semi-limited list for years, being widely regarded as the only card with an actual reason to be at 2 copies nowadays. Despite jumping being between 3 and semi'd for several times throughout the years, Malicious never went any lower than that, being not only the best card that's ever gotten semi-limited, but also the one that has been in and out of this section the most. Despite its tiny stats at 800, Malicious was a problem as soon as it came out, due to being one of the first good graveyard effects Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever got. It was great tribute fodder for all sorts of threats, and it comboed together with Destiny Draw, which could pitch Malicious to the graveyard and make you draw 2, which was by far the best draw engine the game had. Later on, it had value in being a dark that could banish itself to manipulate your graveyard monster count for Dark Armed Dragon. With the release of Synchro Monsters, it was a staple in Teledad decks since Emergency Teleport would let you bring out a level 2 tuner from your deck to set up level 8 Synchro plays easily with Malicious. By the time that Tier 0 deck was addressed, Malicious would then be used in conjunction with Deep Sea Diva, another level 2 tuner for the same kind of plays in the new Diva hero decks. This monster would keep seeing on and off play in decks that could mill it, but its popularity mostly waned until Link Summoning came out. Then Malicious, having come back to 3 for a while now, would once again have its place in the meta by being an extremely powerful extender in all sorts of Link spam decks. Modern BA decks would play it as an excellent card to mill off cards like Dante or Gallus the Starbeast. Phantom Knight and Goki decks would play it due to being easily dumped into the graveyard, and then letting you quickly get multiple Dark Warriors on the field for Isolde or Bardiche. Malicious would eventually be brought back to its home on the semi-limited list, and then the card would rarely be splashed outside of hero decks with easy access to it. Outside of these decks, it was sometimes played as the material for Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, together with Denier instead of Dasher and Celestial, in decks that didn't mind an extra brick, until Verte was banned and DPE stopped being splashed everywhere at least. Malicious has seen the most play out of all the other cards of this list, while also being the only card to still be at 2 out of all of them. Malicious is the most iconic semi-limited card, and the only one that has no reason to leave the semi-list anytime soon, and that's why it easily takes #1 spot on this list. In this list, we'll go over cards that are banned at one point in time, and order them in which are the absolute weakest of all the cards that have ever been banned. Granted, most cards are banned because they're good in some way, so none of these cards are bad, just the weakest of a very small pool of cards that has been banned at some point in the game's history. And at number 10, we have Spore. This card was banned for one format in March 2012, and then unbanned the very next format in September. Spore is a level 1 tuner, which has the effect that if this card is in your graveyard, you can banish another plant-type monster from your graveyard to special summon this card, and then increase its level by the level of the monster banished to activate its effect. And this effect can only be used once per duel. So basically it's a graveyard effect that can activate whenever it wants to bring itself out of the graveyard, which is pretty good, and why it's at the absolute bottom of this list. But this card wasn't really banned because it was super overpowered or anything. You see, in the March 2012 format, Xyz monsters were the new big thing, but everyone was still playing plant synchros because they were still really good, with cards like Glow Up Bulb and Spore. So in order to make sure people stop playing the very strong synchro deck, and start playing more Xyz focused decks, they kind of went heavy-handed on their bans and limits for cards that were part of that toolbox. And Spore just got kind of hit with everything else, even though its power level wasn't really on the same scale as something like Glow Up Bulb. Because one of the combos for Spore was to bring it out of the deck with Lone Fire Blossom, then send it to the graveyard with some kind of synchro summon, and then bring it back by banishing Lone Fire Blossom as a level 4 tuner, which was incredibly rare back then. There was an incredible lack of level 4 tuners during the Synchro era, and the few that did exist could not special summon themselves from the graveyard. So Spore was pretty valuable, just like not overpowered or anything, which is why it got unbanned immediately and put to 1 copy, which was kind of laughable since it has a once per duel effect, so putting it to 1 copy per deck didn't really hurt the card, which was why it was eventually released from the ban list sometime later. And at number 9, we have Chaos Sorcerer, who was banned in September 2006 and stayed banned for a little over 2 years until March 2009. This was one of the original Chaos cards, released alongside monsters like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, and Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End, and was definitely the weakest of the Chaos monsters, but it was still incredibly strong for the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as it was a high-level monster that could easily special summon itself from the hand by just banishing a light and dark monster from the graveyard, and it could banish one monster on the field in place of its attack once per turn. And this was a pretty strong effect back in the days when cards like Smashing Ground were considered a staple card in every deck, which just has the effect to randomly destroy one monster your opponent controls. And it even saw play after it was unbanned in the Synchro and Xyz format. And the only reason this card doesn't see play today is because it's kind of a victim of power creep, where they just released better Chaos monsters over the year, where you don't really want to play Chaos Sorcerer over something like Chaos Dragon Levianeer. And at number 8, we have Mirror Force, which got banned twice. Once in September 2004 for 1 format, then again in September 2005 for 1 format, where it was then put down to limited and eventually taken off the ban list sometime later. Now, Mirror Force currently still sees niche play, so it's not exactly a bad card, but this card was definitely considered overpowered in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! as losing all of your monsters for declaring attack was completely devastating. This card's power level is so strong that it's still not even released in Duel Links. But battle traps are nowhere near as good as they used to be in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, and they only occasionally see competitive play. And Mirror Force kind of has the same problem as Chaos Sorcerer, where it's just fallen to good old power creep, as there's much better versions of Mirror Force in the game now, like Blazing Mirror Force, Storming Mirror Force, Drowning Mirror Force, etc., etc. But they did release some new support for the original Mirror Force in the form of Mirror Force Launcher, which allows you to search it out directly from the deck or graveyard and set it. Although, funny enough, the decks that do play Mirror Force and see competitive success do not use Mirror Force Launcher at all. They just kind of play it alongside some of the other Mirror Force cards and use a whole bunch of stun lockdown cards to stop their opponent from playing the game, or removing their back row. And you can just get a lot of advantage from a Mirror Force wiping out your opponent's field even today. It's just there's better cards that do the same thing now. And at number 7, we have Call of the Haunted, which was banned March 2008 until September 2009. Now, what Call of the Haunted does is it allows you to special summon any one monster from your graveyard in attack position. And if this card is destroyed, it also destroys a monster and vice versa. Now, Call of the Haunted was actually a staple card for a long time, because it allowed you to special summon any monster from your graveyard without restrictions, with the only downside being that it had to be in attack position when you brought it out. And some cards like Card Trooper saw extra value if their floating effects could be activated if your opponent tried to blind MST your face down Call of the Haunted, as you could chain Call of the Haunted to a spell or trap card removal in order to special summon a monster who would then immediately get destroyed by that removal and then activate their effect, like drawing one card if you chose Card Trooper, for example. Or it could just be used in any other case in which you'd want to special summon monsters from the graveyard, which is good in pretty much every deck. This is still a good effect even today. The only problem with this card is that it's a trap card, and the game has evolved to a state where trap cards are kind of slow and not played unless they're very powerful. And Call of the Haunted has just been kind of power crept out of the game, where it's just a little bit too slow for a deck that would want to make use of its effect, and not powerful enough to compete with other trap cards that do get played instead, like Solemn Judgment or Evenly Matched. And at number 6, we have Magician of Faith, which was banned in March 2007, unbanned the next format, then banned again in March 2008, and stayed banned for a long time after. Magician of Faith is one of the few cards in the game which has the distinction of appearing in all forms of the ban list, as it's been forbidden, limited to 1 copy, limited to 2 copies, as well as unlimited like it is today. Now, what Magician of Faith does is it's a flip effect monster which simply allows you to add a spell card from your graveyard to your hand when it's activated. And adding a spell card back to your hand from the graveyard is still an excellent effect even today, and is pretty rare or has some really steep cost to that kind of effect. Although nowadays, flip effect monsters are so slow and hardly used that unless you have some really overpowered support that lets them flip up very often, like the Subterror archetype, they just don't really see any play at all. It's just not very good to set a monster and then wait until your next turn for it to get destroyed and flipped over, and the archetypes which do resolve around flipping are pretty set to their own archetype and don't work on other flip effect monsters. Now, part of the reason this card was so good in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was because of a card called Apprentice Magician, which itself was kind of like a staple card that saw tons in play in lots of decks, and currently doesn't see any play at all, because what this card does is if it's destroyed by battle, you can special summon a level 2 or lower spellcaster type monster from your deck in face down defense position, and Apprentice Magician himself counted for its own effect. And there wasn't very much monster removal back then, so what you could do with the Apprentice Magician was kind of softly stall out with it, by letting your opponent attack into it and then special summon other copies of it from your deck, and then just ending on a Magician of Faith in order to get back a spell card, after going through 3 Apprentice Magicians, and then maybe even using Magician of Faith as tribute fodder on your next turn. It was actually really good, and Apprentice Magician himself even got put on the ban list, though only in a restricted category and never forbidden like Magician of Faith. And at number 5, we have Breaker, the Magical Warrior. This card was banned 2 times for 1 format each, in March 2007 and again in March 2008. Now, Breaker the Magical Warrior has the effect that when it's normal summoned, you can place 1 spell counter on it, and it gains 300 attack for each spell counter, and it has the effect where it can remove a spell counter to destroy 1 spell or trap card on the field. So if you leave the spell counter on it, it becomes a 1900 attack beat stick, which was really good at the time. And if you remove the spell counter to destroy a spell or trap card, that was also really good, as this was in the era when Mystical Space Typhoon was limited to 1 copy. And with cards like Apprentice Magician running around seeing tons of play, which also has another effect where when it's summoned you can place a spell counter on a monster, the average deck could easily refill the spell counter on it occasionally in order for it to destroy multiple spell or trap cards per turn. The game was just slow enough where it was a spell and trap card removal machine, and it even saw tons of play in Duel Links when it was first released, because Breaker the Magical Warrior is just a really good card and low-powered versions of the game, because it has good stats and a great effect on an easy summoning condition that can be splashed into pretty much any deck. Although nowadays, this card doesn't see any play, despite the fact that there are meta decks which revolve around spell counters. It's just way too slow and requires your ever so precious normal summon in order to place a spell counter on it. And unless a level 4 or lower monster has effects that let it special summon itself or something else, or allows you to gain advantage, it generally doesn't see play outside of its archetype, and Breaker doesn't really have a traditional archetype, and it's just not strong enough of a staple for the current metagame. Especially now that we have cards like Twin Twisters and Lightning Storm running around, clearing back row like crazy. You don't really need to waste your normal summon to clear one card anymore. And at number 4, we have Injection Fairy Lily, which was banned in one format in March 2004. Now, what this card does is on a small baseline attack of only 400, if this card battles a monster, you can pay 2,000 life points to have it gain 3,000 attack during that one battle. So, with Injection Fairy Lily, in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! You could beat over your opponent's Blue Eyes White Dragon, or summon Skull with this one normal summon monster, since it could easily beat 2,500 or 3,000 attack by just paying 2,000 life points. And it was also a soft defensive wall, as if you had the full 8,000 starting life points, your opponent would have to attack over this card 4 times before you wouldn't be able to activate the effect anymore to destroy the attacking monster, assuming they were attacking with monsters with less than 3,400 attack. And all of this was quite the big deal in the early days of the game. Big enough where it was kind of a staple card, and was staple enough to even be banned for an entire format. Although nowadays, this card doesn't really see any play, as battle damage only related effects are not a big deal. The standard strategy for meta decks is to clear your opponent's monsters with card effects, and then attack for a whole bunch of damage that you just happen to have on the board that also cleared out your opponent's monsters. And the only cards with battle effects that do see play are ones that can be brought out of the extra deck, or summoned very easy and have good protection. You just don't really play main deck monsters that require a normal summon to beat over monsters anymore. Although, the last time this card did see play was when Spellbook of Judgment was still legal, since that deck was all about buffing up spellcasters to attack over your opponent's monsters, while also clearing their field with Spellbook spell cards. And then gained a whole bunch of advantage during the end phase. Injection Fairy Lily kind of fit nice in there, and could easily allow you to activate the effect of Spellbook of Power, which required you to beat over something by battle in order to search out a Spellbook spell card from your deck. Could be protected with Spellbook of Wisdom, and could even be brought out of the deck with Spellbook of Judgment if you didn't want to bring out Jiaojin the Spiritualist for whatever reason. Although after the golden age of spellbooks ended, so did any competitive use of Injection Fairy Lily, as it no longer sees any competitive play. And at number 3, we have United We Stand, which was banned for one format in September 2004, all the way until March 2005. Now, this is an equip spell card which increases the attack and defense of the monster it's equipped to by 800 for each face-up monster you control. And if you controlled 5 monsters, this one card could give a monster a 4,000 attack boost, which is enough to beat over pretty much any monster in the game, and can instantly win you the game if you attack directly with a monster that can attack twice. So back in the day, when battle damage mattered, as this card was banned one format after Injection Fairy Lily, this was a little bit too strong of an attack boost from one card. In fact, the modern equip cards still don't give the amount of attack as United We Stand can. However, this card still suffers the same weakness that all equip cards have, where they're just too vulnerable. If the monster equipped to it is destroyed, this card is also lost in the process, giving your opponent a nice plus if they have any kind of monster removal. The opponent can also just destroy this card with any spell or trap card removal, and it's also vulnerable to cards that flip monsters face down. There's just too many ways to deal with equipped cards where any Mystical Space Typhoon, Smashing Grounds, or Book of Moon could stop this card, where they eventually decided it wasn't really necessary to ban the card since it was so easy to play around. And even if they did give an incredible attack boost, it was only an incredible attack boost in best case scenario anyway. And if you have 5 monsters on your side of the field, chances are you're in a pretty good game state to begin with, and activating United We Stand would just be akin to a win more card, which implies that you are probably going to win anyway. unless your opponent had a face-down Mirror Force, which just wipes out your field. And for being an equipped spell card with no kind of protection or floating effects, it definitely has to take a top spot on this list, as one of the weakest previously banned cards, but still a pretty solid card nonetheless. And at number 2, we have Victory Dragon, which was banned in March 2006, unbanned in the next format in September 2006, and then banned again for good in March 2007, where it has stayed banned till this day. Now, this is the first card on this list that is still currently banned, but it's not really a good card, to be perfectly honest. What this card does is if it declares a direct attack and reduces your opponent's life points to 0, then you win the match. Now, remember, the match is the best 2 out of 3 that you can play in competitive tournaments, so if you pull this card's effect off during the first duel, it will auto-win you your next duel, so it kind of counts as an instant win effect for a duel that hasn't even took place yet, which definitely sounds like a good effect, and it's because of this effect that the card is currently banned. However, this card has all kinds of restrictions and rulings to it that make it not very good. The card itself cannot be special summoned, and can only be tribute summoned by tributing 3 dragon-type monsters specifically. It only has 2400 attack for this, which isn't super great for all the resources required to bring it out, and it has to declare a direct attack, which means it can't do battle damage by attacking over a monster. So they have to make sure to clear your opponent's field and then attack with Victory Dragon last. And if you're able to complete all of this during your first turn, your opponent can completely shut down its effect by just simply surrendering before Victory Dragon declares its attack, or before the attack resolves for that matter. As in the TCG, you're allowed to surrender a duel at any point. So if you just simply give up before Victory Dragon attacks, then its effect cannot take place, which completely negates the effect right out the gate. Any person who just knows this little ruling can completely avoid the effect, and generally competitive players are going to know about this, and the ban list is created around competitive decks, so if they unban Victory Dragon, there's a good chance it wouldn't see any play. But it's more about setting a precedent. They don't want an effect that's potentially powerful to exist in the game, and in fact, they give this effect to all the illegal cards that they give out as prize winners. So it would be weird for the only legal version of this card in the game to be playable, when they so often give this effect to unplayable cards. And at number 1, we have Self-Destruct Button, which was banned in January 2014 and is still banned to this day. Now, this card has the effect that if your life points are lower than your opponent's by 7,000 or more, you can activate this card to make both players' life points become 0. Now, this card can only ever cause tie games, as there's no way to take advantage of this card with legal cards that exist in the game in order to circumvent your loss as well. And a card which can only cause tie games can't exactly win you the game. The reason this card is banned is because it encourages stall decks and kind of gives them a backup strategy in case things go south. You see, decks like the Final Countdown stall deck would play Self-Destruct Button as kind of a backup plan, where all they would do is stall out as long as possible until Final Countdown won them the game after 20 turns. But if for any reason their opponent was actually able to get them low on life points and maybe even win the game, you could just use Self-Destruct Button to cause a tie, in order to try again in the next game, as Self-Destruct Button was very easy to meet its conditions in Final Countdown decks, and it was also causing matches to go on too long, and was encouraging a very unsportsmanlike type of gameplay, of taking advantage of the fact that you can basically tie as much as you want, and you play until someone wins 2 games, or you go into time rules. So for a card that doesn't actually win you the game at all, and is purely on the ban list because people were trolling with it, I kind of have to give Self-Destruct Button the number 1 on this list, as being technically the weakest banned card in the game, that is definitely banned for a good reason nonetheless. In this video, we'll be going over cards which got banned the quickest after being released in the TCG. And at number 10, we have the Phantom Knights of Rusty Bardiche. This card was banned 8 months after it was released, which is 5 months faster than they banned Chaos Emperor Dragon, a card which was so broken and overpowered that it basically created the ban list, and that card wasn't banned until 13 months after it was released. Now, why was the Phantom Knights of the Rusty Bardiche banned? Well, it tried to pull a sneaky one by having a cost which was actually a benefit, while also having a good effect for that cost. This is a Link 3 monster which requires 2+ dark monsters as its materials, and since the dark attribute is arguably the best attribute in the game, that's a super easy requirement to fulfill for a lot of decks. And it has the effect where you can send a Phantom Knight monster from your deck to the graveyard as a cost in order to set a Phantom Knight spell or trap card directly from your deck. Now, Phantom Knight monsters have effects in the graveyard, with a couple of them allowing you to straight up search out other Phantom Knight cards from your deck with their graveyard effects. So, sending Phantom Knight monsters to the graveyard is a good effect. And the Phantom Knight spell or trap cards that you can set are also good. There are 2 really good targets for setting with this card's effect, and then there's also a handful of other just normal good targets. The Phantom Knight archetype has a lot of good cards that are very good at playing well with other archetypes as well. So Rusty Bardiche was seen playing a whole bunch of decks, and essentially allowed you to go +2 off of its effect, on top of the fact that it had great arrows, and another effect on top of it. If a Dark Xyz monster is special summoned into a zone this card points to, you get to destroy 1 card on the field. And the Phantom Knights have a card called Phantom Knights of Break Sword, which is arguably one of the best rank 3 Xyz monsters in the game, who has an effect to destroy cards as well. So an easy to bring out card that lets you go +2 off of its normal effect, while also having a good effect in addition to that can be splashed into other decks as an engine. Well, it's no wonder this card was banned so quickly, and even beats out all of the famous banned cards. Mainly because there wasn't really a ban list back then, until Chaos Emperor Dragon came out. And at number 9, we have True King Lithosagem, the Disaster. This card was banned 7 months after it was released into TCG, and has recently come off the Forbidden List, and is only a limited monster, where you can play 1 per deck. Now, this card came out with all the other True King monsters, who all basically have the same effect, where you can special summon this card from your hand by destroying 2 monsters on your field or in your hand, with at least one of them sharing the same attribute as that True King monster. And then where the True Kings differed is with their second effect, where if you chose to destroy 2 monsters who are both of the same attribute, where Earth attribute in Lithosagem's case, you could look at your opponent's extra deck and then banish 3 monsters with different names. Since most people only play 1 copy of staple extra deck monsters, getting this card out and using its effect could essentially rob your opponent out of a way to out whatever strategy you're doing, or completely screw up their combo pieces if they only played 1 copy of crucial extra deck monsters, like Spiral Double Helix, or ABC Dragon Buster for example. And if used in dinosaur decks, where destroying cards in your hand allows you to special summon dinosaurs from your deck, that card was just absolutely broken, especially since it can then be used to go into True King of All Calamities, which allows you to lock your opponent out of monster effects for a turn. It was just a tiny bit better than all the other True Kings, especially for some of the monsters of its attribute. So it got banned for being both a great support card and having a powerful effect, on top of being a good support card. And people were very surprised to see this card being set to limited, because its ability to snipe your opponent's extra deck monsters is just that good. And at number 8, we have Zodiac Broad Bull. This card was released in the exact same set as True King Lithosagem, and was banned in the exact same ban list, which means it was banned 7 months after its release. And since these 2 cards have the exact same dates on them, I put Broad Bull ahead in the list because it's still currently banned. Because also, technically, Zodiac Trident shares all of these details as well. Came out in the same sets and was banned in the exact same ban list. But that card is currently limited, so I just added the 1 to this list that is still currently banned. But technically this spot on the list goes to both of them, since they were both kind of banned for the same reason. You see, with Zodiac Broad Bull and Zodiac Trident, and Zodiac Ratpir 3 copies, these were used in one of the few Tier 0 decks in the game's history, a very exclusive list that has less than 10 decks on it. And Zodiacs have a distinct accomplishment of having at least 1 competitive event, with every single topping participant playing a version of a Zodiac deck. And I don't think any deck before or since then has had a 100% representation rate in top tables at a competitive event, as the requirements for being Tier 0 is to have more than 65% representation at those kinds of events, which Zodiacs were able to beat very easily. So what made the deck so good, especially Zodiac Broad Bull? Well, it was their hyper consistency. A deck needs to be consistent in order for it to be viable. It needs to have ways to search out their main combo pieces, while also establishing a strong board, destroying your opponent's monsters, and then maybe getting a floodgate out or some way to disrupt plays. And Zodiacs could do all of this with any 1 card from their deck, as the gimmick to Zodiacs was all of the Zodiac Xyz monsters could be summoned with any Zodiac monster once per turn, including other Zodiac Xyz monsters. If you wanted to bring them out again, you'd have to Xyz summon them the old-fashioned way. And Zodiac Broad Bowl allowed you to search out any Beast Warrior type monster from your deck, as long as it had the availability to be normal summoned. And this effect was a soft once per turn. And to bring this card out normally, you just needed 2 level 4 monsters. So, with Zodiac Ratpier being a level 4 monster, and essentially allowing to get out 2 other copies of itself from the deck, you could easily bring out all 3 of your Zodiac Broad Bowls in a single turn, and then get 3 searches off of all of them, and then rank one of them up into Zodiac Trident, who could easily disrupt plays during your opponent's turn. And if your opponent did manage to destroy all of your cards, your deck was so hyper consistent, you could set up again during your next turn with no problem, which is kind of a problem for an archetype, if they're not actually stopped or slowed down by getting all of their stuff destroyed. Which is why these 2 cards were banned so quickly, and absolutely dominated all kinds of events before that happened. And at number 7, we have Performapal Monkey Board. This card was banned 7 months after it was released in the TCG, which is tied with the previous 2 spots on this list. However, Monkey Board was banned about 5 days earlier than the previous 2, who share the exact same dates. So since it was banned a tiny bit earlier, which means it was banned a little bit faster, it takes a higher spot on this list. Now, Performapal Monkey Board was involved in another Tier 0 deck, as it has an effect where, when this card is placed as a scale, you can add a level 4 lower Performapal monster from your deck to your hand. Now, at first glance, this doesn't really seem that bad, and its scale and monster effects don't really seem that broken either. It's just the archetype it belongs to happens to have a lot of really good cards in it, but also allow you to search out all of their other cards from the archetype. And Monkey Board is like the ultimate starter for that deck. I've heard it described before that Monkey Board is like the searcher that searches your searchers, who will then search your other searchers. And since the Performapal deck was Tier 0, it was also known as the Pepe deck when it was in full force, as there will be another card from that archetype on this list, banning this one card was a way for them to kind of stop its hyper consistency, for kind of the same reasons they banned Zodiac Broad Bowl. And at number 6, we have Topologic Gumblar Dragon. This card was banned 6 months after it came out, and the reason this card was banned so quickly is because it allowed you to pretty easily discard 6 cards from your opponent's hand before they had a chance to play the game. As what this card does is it's a Link 4 monster with some of the easiest materials to accomplish, just 2+ effect monsters, and has 2 effects on the field. One of them is if a card is special summoned to a zone a Link monster points to, you can discard 2 random cards from your hand to make your opponent discard the same amount. It also has another effect where if it's extra linked when it's summoned, you then get to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand without a cost. So what people would do with this card is bring it out with an extra link to discard 2 cards, then activate its effect on your turn normally by just special summoning a card to a link zone. Then during your opponent's turn, players would use Link Karibo to special summon itself to one of your link zones during your opponent's turn in order to activate its effect to discard 2 cards again, which, if you went first, allowed you to get rid of 6 cards in your opponent's hand before they got a chance to play, essentially getting rid of their entire hand. And with how Goki decks could accomplish this thanks to Isolde and Phoenix Blade, Topologic Gumblar Dragon became a win condition on its own. And the only reason it took 6 months to ban this card was because no one was really using it for the first 2 months it came out. Once people discovered how good it could be if it was made the central strategy of your deck, everyone started playing the hand loop and got this card banned as soon as the next ban list came out. And at number 5, we have Nightmare Goblin, who was only in the game for 4 months before he got banned. Funny enough, part of the reason people weren't using Topologic Gumblar Dragon when it first came out is because Nightmare Goblin was still legal. And what this card does is it essentially gives you double summon on basically a generic Link 2 monster with great arrows, as it just requires any 2 monsters with different names as its materials, which means you can use tokens. And when this card is summoned, you can discard 1 card in order to normal summon 1 additional time to a zone this card points to. And if this card was co-linked when it was summoned, you get to draw an additional card. In addition, your co-linked monsters cannot be targeted by card effects. So this card was essential in setting up an unbreakable board, as it gave you that ever so crucial extra normal summon, advanced your combo plays with its great arrows, and easily allowed you to take advantage of its protection with its great arrows. With Nightmare Goblin and the other Nightmare support cards, you could have a Tri-Gate Wizard on the field who couldn't be destroyed by anything, targeted by anything, and could negate 1 thing per turn, all while making that Tri-Gate Wizard easier to get out, since most meta decks are kind of balanced around only having 1 normal summon. So gaining an additional one on top of a combo extender was just way too much advantage, and that's why this card got banned pretty quickly. And at number 4, we have the Baby Rulers, who were banned 4 months after their release. Now, these cards were banned in the same amount of time as Nightmare Goblin, but Nightmare Goblin was playable for about 2 weeks longer than the Baby Rulers, so technically they were banned a little bit faster. You see, when the Dragon Rulers first came out, they were an archetype of 8 monsters, the 4 big ones and then the 4 baby ones, whose only effects were to discard themselves as well as another dragon type or a fire attribute monster from your hand in order to special summon the adult version of themselves from your deck. And since the Dragon Rulers themselves are still considered some of the best cards in the game's history, banning all of the Baby Rulers was just Konami's way of trying to fix the problem. It's kind of like how they banned Performapal Monkey Board or Zodiac Broad Bowl. They didn't want to have to ban the entire archetype, so they were trying to hit some of the combo extenders. But as it turned out, Dragon Rulers was still very strong even with all of their baby cards banned. So they eventually were limited, and then banned 23 months after their introduction. But in their first round of trying to rein in the Dragon Rulers, they banned all of the Baby Rulers very quickly after 4 months, which did slow down their consistency, but the main deck monsters were so good that 3 of them are still banned to this day, and they only removed 1 of them from the ban list to see if they were still as broken as they used to be. And since that one non-banned Dragon Ruler has seen consistent competitive success since it was unbanned after 4 years, that should say a little something about the power level of the entire deck when it was at full power. A deck that was never actually tier 0 surprisingly, because of the next spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Spellbook of Judgment, a card which was banned 4 months after it came out, and was released in the exact same set as the Dragon Rulers, and was banned in the exact same ban list as the Baby Rulers. And while all of the Baby Rulers are now unbanned, Spellbook of Judgment is still very much banned, which is why I put it at a higher spot on this list. Now, I've talked about Spellbook of Judgment a lot in my other videos, and that's partly because it's one of the strongest single cards in the game's history, so something like this will show up a lot in lists that talk about the best cards in the game. As what this card does is, during the end phase, you get to add Spellbook spell cards from your deck to your hand up to the number of spell cards you activated that turn. And then you get to special summon a spellcaster type monster from your deck who has a level less than or equal to the number of cards you added to your hand. And the Spellbook spell cards are pretty good. It's kind of like the case with the Phantom Knights of Rusty Bardiche. It allows you to gain advantage with good cards, as even after Spellbook of Judgment was banned, Spellbook decks are still a competitive deck at top events. So being able to go +7 off of its effect, and bringing out basically any spellcaster type monster from your deck on top of that, is just some of the best advantage you could possibly get. It allowed you to use all the cards in your hand. No, scratch that. It encouraged you to use every card in your hand, to great effect at that, so that you can then refill your hand with everything you want during the end phase, and then maybe bring out a floodgate like Jiaojin the Spiritualist to lock your opponent out of special summoning monsters. If Spellbook of Judgment only had the effect to add cards to your hand during the end phase, it would still be really good, but I don't know about one of the most broken cards of all time. The fact that it also lets you special summon a monster from the deck is what pushes that card into legendary tier, which is why Dragon Rulers were never tier 0. This one card was so good, it single-handedly stopped the best archetype in the game's history from reaching tier 0 status, which is why it was banned so quickly after it came out. It basically only existed for one ban list cycle, and will probably never be taken off the ban list without an errata. And at number 2, we have Perform Mage Plushfire, which was banned 3 months after it was released in the TCG. This is another combo piece of the Pepe deck that the Performapal Monkey Board was part of, except this card is a little bit more broken, as it has an effect where if this card on the field is destroyed, you can special summon a Perform Mage monster from your hand or deck. Special summoning monsters from your deck is one of the best effects in the game. The extra effect on Spellbook of Judgment is part of the reason it's so powerful, and here's the thing with Plushfire. Its effect is not once per turn. Pendulum decks love to destroy their own cards, and Pepe decks could do that just as well as any, and Plushfire could even special summon itself from the field if it was in one of your scales, if one of your Perform Mage monsters was destroyed. But the power of this card came from pendulum summoning, as when this card first came out, you could pendulum summon as many monsters from your extra deck as you had empty spaces on the field. Which is something they don't allow you to do anymore, even after the Master Rule revisions. Pendulum monsters from the extra deck must go into extra monster zones. So you could set this card as a scale, have it destroyed with one of your many self-destruction effects, which would then activate its effect to special summon a monster from your deck. Then you could pendulum summon this monster out in order to destroy it again to special summon another monster from your deck, since its effect is not once per turn. You could destroy multiple copies of this card to special summon multiple cards from your deck. And since Pendulum decks destroy their own cards in order to gain other effects, you're basically gaining advantage off of having to pay a cost for other cards, which we're gaining advantage off of those costs. There is another banned card called Double Iris Magician, who simply allows you to search a card from its archetype from your deck to your hand when it's destroyed in the same way as Plushfire. Both of these cards are good. Plushfire is just way better, and that's why it got banned so quickly, 3 months after it was released in the TCG, and was part of another one of the few Tier 0 decks in the game's history. The number 1 spot on this list only beats it out by about 1 week. And at number 1, we have Sixth Sense. Now, this card was actually banned in the OCG for a long time, and was just never released in the TCG until many, many years after its first introduction. So when they did release it to the TCG, rather than release a new card that was already banned, they decided to unban it first to kind of test the waters, saw that it was still broken, and then banned it as soon as the next ban list came around. As what this card does is it allows you to declare 2 numbers from 1 to 6. Then your opponent rolls a dice. And if the results of one of those 2 numbers is one of the ones you declared, you get to draw that many cards from your deck. And if the result is something else, you instead send that many cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard. Now, the way you use this card is to basically always call 5 or 6. That way, if your opponent rolls a 5 or 6, you get to draw the near maximum amount of cards for this card's effect. And since the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is balanced around the fact that one card which allows you to draw 2 cards is considered super good, being able to draw 6 cards is just straight broken. But it technically is a gamble effect, where if you don't call it correctly, you instead have to send the top 1 to 4 cards of your deck to the graveyard. However, this effect is also good. Most decks love to have their monsters in the graveyard. That's why a card like The Grass Looks Greener is banned. All that card does is send cards from your deck to the graveyard. Granted, a whole bunch of cards, but being able to send 1 to 4 is a positive effect as well. Just not as good as its draw effect. So when you use Sixth Sense, you have a 1 in 3 chance of either getting a game-breaking effect that essentially wins you the game on its own, or you get a decent effect. But either way, you come out with a net positive. And since this one card can essentially win you the game on its own with its advantage, without really a downside to it, the card just kind of got banned as soon as they were able to ban it, because this card was also released when the Dragon Rulers were still around and not banned yet, and they love to put cards in the graveyard too. So you bet every single Dragon Ruler deck was playing this card, even if it was limited to 1 copy per deck. And you can absolutely guarantee that it won people games on its own for the 3 months that it was legal to play. In this video, we'll look at cards that were placed on the ban list in some way, shape, or form, and go over why some of these cards, which look particularly unimpressive at first glance, were placed on the ban list. And at number 10, we have Apprentice Magician. This card has the effect that when it's summoned, you can place a spell counter on a card that can have spell counters on it. And if this card is destroyed by battle, you can special summon a level 2 or lower spellcaster monster from your deck in face-down defense position. Now, in the current meta of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card would not be useful at all because it's too slow, and has a battle destruction floating effect. But in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, cards which can replace themselves after being destroyed by battle were pretty decent, and actually saw play here or there. And this particular card was semi-limited for about 2 years, from March 2006 to March 2008. So why was this card semi-limited for 2 years? Well, for 2 reasons. First off, Breaker the Magical Warrior was one of the most played staple cards in the game, and in fact was limited on the ban list during this time period, and was even forbidden for one format during the time Apprentice Magician was semi-limited. And what Breaker does is it can remove a spell counter from itself to destroy a spell or trap card on the field. Normally, this card only gains 1 spell counter when it's normal summoned, so Apprentice Magician allowed you to refill it with spell counters to destroy more spell and trap cards. And since Apprentice Magician could summon other copies of itself, you could potentially refill the spell counters on Breaker multiple times. That's not all. Apprentice Magician also had 3 really good targets from the deck, besides other copies of itself. During the time period Apprentice Magician was semi-limited, Magician of Faith was also not banned yet, and Magician of Faith eventually got banned in December 2007, and stayed banned for a really long time before coming off the list. Because what it would do is allow you to recycle any spell card from your graveyard, and it can be searched directly from your deck after refueling a spell counter, which was pretty good. Apprentice Magician also allowed you to search out Old Vindictive Magician, who could destroy a monster when it's flipped face up, and could search out Hand of Nephthys, which would allow you to special summon a Sacred Phoenix directly from your hand or deck. And in this time period, decks were slow enough where you could realistically use both of Apprentice Magician's effects. So it was actually pretty good in this format, and saw play in competitive decks. And then it came off the ban list once they banned Breaker the Magical Warrior for the second time, and then they also banned Magician of Faith. So with those two cards banned, they didn't really need Apprentice Magician semi-limited anymore, so they put it to unlimited, and then left it there even after Breaker came off the ban list again. And then the speed of the game got to the point where it was no longer good. This one has a couple of good reasons as to why it was on the ban list, although you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't played during those formats, as this card sees absolutely no competitive play in today's Yu-Gi-Oh! And that will be kind of the name of the game for like the first half of this list. Some of these cards were pretty decent during the time they came out, and that's why they were put on the ban list in some way, shape, or form, but are pretty laughable when compared to today's metagame. And at number 9, we have Protector of the Sanctuary, who was limited to 1 copy per deck for like 3 years in the time period of 2004 to 2007. Now, what this card does is, while this card is out in the field, your opponent cannot draw cards except during their draw phase. So, on surface level, the way to use this card would be to stop your opponent from using things like Pot of Greed, or cards that let them draw outside of their draw phase. Of course, this card was rarely used for its intended purpose, and was almost always used in order to get rid of your opponent's hand. Because you see, there are certain cards in the game, like Disturbance Strategy, which force your opponent to shuffle their hand back into their deck and then draw the same number of cards. But if you had something like Protector of the Sanctuary out in the field, then they would just shuffle their hand back into their deck and draw nothing. And then they would just lose their entire hand to a 2-card combo, which is really good. That's why this card has a whole bunch of extra rulings in place, things you just have to know, where you basically cannot use the effects like Disturbance Strategy if Protector of the Shrine is on the field already. So you have to kind of cheat those extra rulings by chaining something like Call of the Haunted to Disturbance Strategy, so that you can get Protector of the Sanctuary out on the field as the chain resolves backwards. And then your opponent will lose their entire hand to a 3-card combo, except one that requires a little setup in the graveyard first. And since there were workarounds to its special ruling, this card was limited so you wouldn't be able to get rid of your opponent's entire hand so easily, especially when the meta in the early portions of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was to get rid of cards from your opponent's hand. But then eventually this strategy became outdated and was nothing more than a gimmick, so it got released from the ban list because it didn't really need to be limited anymore, nor did it really need to be limited in the first place. And at number 8, we have Marauding Captain. This card was semi-limited for 3 years, from 2002 to 2005. And what this card does is, when it's normal summoned, you can special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your hand. So it's really good at swarming the field from your hand, as it can target any level 4 lower monster in your hand, especially in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! When special summoning was pretty difficult to do. And few monster cards had effects to special summon. However, it was most likely put on the ban list for its first effect, where your opponent cannot target your warrior monsters for attacks except this one. So if you had 2 copies of Marauding Captain out, and you only played warrior-type monsters, your opponent could not attack you, as the 2 captains would loop to each other in a way that made it so you were basically immune to attacks. And since Marauding Captain could special summon another Marauding Captain from your hand, this loop could be accomplished as long as you just had 2 copies of the card in your hand, which was incredibly easy to pull off. So it was limited to 2 copies to make it less likely to pull off the unattackable combo, until they eventually figured out it wasn't a big deal anymore, and just released it from the ban list. As without being able to destroy these cards by battle, the only way to break the effect loop was to destroy them by card effects. And there were lots of strong spell or trap cards back then that could destroy monsters, so it wasn't the hardest thing to break against the average meta deck. But it was still something they didn't like very much, so they tried to restrict it with a semi-limit. And at number 7, we have Backup Soldier. This is a trap card that can only be activated if you have 5 or more monsters in your graveyard, which will then allow you to target up to 3 of your non-effect monsters with less than 1500 attack in your graveyard, and then add them to your hand. So with full setup, this card is a +2 in card advantage, which is pretty good. And that's why this card was limited and semi-limited on the ban list for 2 years, in the very early parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! In like January 2001. Now, the reason this card was taken off the ban list is because back then, there wasn't really a good use for vanilla monsters with less than 1500 attack. So even if you could go +2 off of this effect, it required a lot of setup, and it didn't really give you useful cards. The best use of those monsters was probably just to use them as discard fodder with other things like Graceful Charity, which was still legal at this time. So I'm pretty sure this card was only on the ban list because it was a +2 on paper, which sounds good, and then it was eventually removed because those cards weren't very useful, especially in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Before you could use low attack vanilla monsters as combo pieces. And at number 6, we have Yellow Gadget, which was semi-limited in the September 2007 format only, and then was put back to unlimited in the very next format, and was never placed on the ban list ever again. And this card was semi-limited alongside the other 2 gadgets, and what the gadgets are is basically if one of them is summoned, they can search out one of the other 2 from the deck, except each one searches out a specific gadget. So if you play 3 copies of all 3 gadgets, you'll be able to search out all of them with only 1 gadget, eventually. So the gadgets were always pretty decent as each one was a +1 when they were summoned, and they allowed you to consistently add monsters to your hand while swarming the field. But there was never really a good way to use them before Synchros came out in 2008, Machina Fortress came out in 2009, or until Exceeds monsters came out in 2011. And you may notice all of the best uses of gadgets weren't until after they were semi-limited, and then put back to unlimited. So why were they randomly semi-limited for this one format in 2007 before any of their good support came out? I don't actually know the real answer to this question, other than the fact that gadgets were always just kind of decent, especially if used with Ultimate Offering, and they were just released in English that year. But also, during the same ban lists, they moved Pot of Avarice from limited to semi-limited, and then they also added the Transmigration Prophecy to the ban list for the first time, putting it at limited where it stayed for a really long time. And both of these cards directly help gadgets, as being able to recycle them back into the deck means the gadgets can keep adding cards to their hand longer. So I'd assume they semi-limited the gadgets because they didn't want to make Pot of Avarice too strong, and then immediately figured out that wasn't really a problem, so they just removed them from the ban list in the next format. And even when Exceeds monsters came out, and the gadgets were actually super good when combined with Ultimate Offering, they didn't put gadgets on the ban list again, and instead just banned Ultimate Offering. So it was kind of odd that they appeared on the ban list in the first place. And at number 5, we have Gravekeeper's Servant. This is a continuous spell card, which has the effect where your opponent must send the top card of their deck to the graveyard in order to declare an attack. And this card was semi-limited on the ban list for about 3 formats in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! From July 2000 until January 2001. And Gravekeeper's Servant has a really good combo with cards like Macrocosmos that banishes all cards instead of sending them to the graveyard, where if you have these 2 cards out on the field at the same time, your opponent cannot declare an attack, since they can't technically send the top card of their deck to the graveyard. But these combos didn't exist this early on in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So the reason this card was actually put on the ban list was because they thought effortless mill cards were good back then, so they just kind of hit a lot of cards randomly that could mill, and then eventually decided they weren't a big deal and just removed them from the ban list. And even when Macrocosmos did come out, they did not put Gravekeeper's Servant back on the ban list. And at number 4, we have Drop Off. This card has an effect where, when your opponent draws a card for the draw phase, your opponent discards 1 card they just drew. And this card was semi-limited for 1 format started in 2006, before it went back to unlimited in the very next format. Now, this effect is okay. It's basically just a 1-for-1 trade, and it denies your opponent their draw phase essentially. But it's kind of limited in its uses, as it can only be played during your opponent's draw phase. You have to wait for your opponent's turn in order to get rid of that card, and that's only useful if you're trying to deny your opponent's hand from having cards in it in general. Otherwise, you could play any other combo extender or generic staple over Drop Off. And that's why this card was a staple in hand control decks, which were part of the first meta decks in the earliest formats of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as this card was played alongside Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and the Forceful Sentry. So when these 3 cards eventually got banned, it would make sense that Drop Off just kind of got hit by association. But that's not really the case, because you see, the Forceful Sentry was banned a year earlier in March 2005. Delinquent Duo got banned 2 years earlier in 2004, before it came off the ban list for a little bit, and then went back on the ban list in September 2005. and confiscation was still limited to 1 copy at the time drop-off was put to semi-limited. So, none of these dates really add up. It doesn't really make any sense why they semi-limited drop-off, and it wasn't really doing anything, since the days of the hand control decks were long over by the time it got hit. But during the March 2006 ban list, the one which put drop-off to 2 copies, they also banned 8 other iconic banned cards. So it was a huge ban list for getting rid of overpowered cards in the game. So I think they just kind of went a little ban happy and hit drop-off since, well, it used to be played in good decks, and then figured out it wasn't actually that good. So they released it from the ban list in the next format, where it has never appeared on the ban list again since. And at number 3, we have Emergency Provisions, which I think is the only pure life point gain card to ever appear on the ban list, outside of the world's special ban list. And this card was semi-limited for a full year, from March 2005 to March 2006. And what this card does is it allows you to send as many of your other spell and trap cards on the field to the graveyard in order to increase your life points by 1,000 per card sent. Now, normally, pure life point gain cards are not very good, unless you have a way of using life point gains to your advantage. And the reason people were using Emergency Provisions was because it was a quick play spell card that could send your other spell and traps to the graveyard. The fact that it gave life points was kind of an added bonus, but I'm sure the people who used Emergency Provisions kind of wished it did something better, because during the same time period this card was semi-limited, they also put Good Goblin Housekeeping on the semi-limited list. Good Goblin Housekeeping allows you to draw a card +1 equal to the number of Good Goblin Housekeepings you have in your graveyard. Then you get to select 1 card from your hand and return it to the bottom of your deck. So if you use this card with no copies in your graveyard, you go -1 off of its effect. And that -1 continues to increase until eventually it turns into a +1, if you have 2 copies of the card in your graveyard. So if you combo this card with Emergency Provisions, you could activate Emergency Provisions in response to Good Goblin Housekeeping, or multiple copies of it, which would then resolve backwards, sending the Good Goblin Housekeepings to the graveyard before their effects activate. And then their effects will still activate on the field, counting the copies of themselves in the graveyard for their own effects. So that would allow you to draw an additional card for each Good Goblin Housekeeping, and could turn its potential +1 into a potential +2, which could be transferred over to all the other copies if you played multiple at the same time. Now, this surprisingly isn't a super good combo, but Konami was limiting a lot of their draw cards in this time period, so they hit all potential combos no matter how consistent they were. And when Emergency Provisions came off the ban list, they didn't take Good Goblin Housekeeping off the ban list too until a year later, in March 2007, even though it wasn't really seen competitive play very much. And at number 2, we have Injection Fairy Lily. This card was limited in 2002, where it stayed until it was banned for 1 format in 2004, and then it was then put back to limited in September 2004, where it stayed until March 2007, when it was taken off the ban list completely. And what this card does is, if this card battles a monster, you can pay 2,000 life points to increase the attack of this card by 3,000, during the damage calculation only. So at 400 base attack, this card could beat over any monster with less than 3,300 attack, which was basically all the monsters in the game at that point. And since this was a level 3 monster that could beat over big beat sticks like Summon Skull, just by paying tons of life points, regardless if it was attacked or attacking, made it pretty good in those days of beatdown decks. Because you could also use this effect if you were just attacking directly, for a large chunk of life point damage. However, this card wasn't that good, and definitely not ban-worthy, as it's one of the 3 cards in the game's history that was only banned for 1 format. I think this card was only really banned because they didn't want a small, easy-to-summon level 3 monster to be able to beat over boss monsters that required resources in order to bring out, regardless if it was meta-defining or not, which is why it was an odd card to be placed on the ban list. Even if it was technically good, it never saw the amount of competitive play that would warrant its limitations. This card on the ban list seems more like an over-precaution rather than being put on there for being abused in the game. And since they were so afraid of this card potentially being good that it got banned, I think this card could easily take a top spot on this list, but not the number 1 spot. And at number 1, we have Dark Scorpion, Chick the Yellow, who was semi-limited for one format in March 2005. Now, normally, the Dark Scorpions are kind of a joke archetype for being bad, as the only good Dark Scorpion card that saw lots of competitive play was Don Zalug, who didn't even have Dark Scorpion in his name. And yet, randomly, Chick the Yellow showed up on the ban list for one format before going back to Unlimited. So why was this card placed on the ban list? Well, because of its interactions with another banned card called Makura the Destructor. You see, Makura has an effect that when it's sent to the graveyard, you can activate trap cards from your hand for the rest of the turn. So if you use Call the Haunted from your hand in order to bring back Chick the Yellow, and if Chick the Yellow inflicted battle damage to your opponent, he can activate its first effect that allows you to target any one card on the field and return it to the hand. So, if you then just targeted your own Call the Haunted and returned it to your hand, Chick the Yellow would get destroyed due to Call the Haunted's effect, and then you'd have the Call the Haunted back in your hand. And here's the thing about trap cards, all of them are spell speed 2 or higher, including the continuous trap cards like Call the Haunted. As being spell speed 2, you can activate Call the Haunted during the battle phase, if you have the availability of activating trap cards from your hand, with Makura's effect. So you could then just activate Call the Haunted from your hand during that same battle phase, bring back Chick the Yellow, who could then attack again and activate its effect to return Call the Haunted back to your hand. And then it would go back to the graveyard, and then you could just repeat this combo for an infinite amount of life point damage. So it seems pretty reasonable that they put Chick the Yellow on the ban list, since Call the Haunted was already a very heavily played staple in this era, and all they had to do was just play Makura and Chick the Yellow in order to potentially give them an unlimited amount of attacks during the battle phase, assuming they could attack directly, of course. However, here's the interesting thing about the March 2005 format. This is the exact same ban list which banned Makura the Destructor. So the whole reason Chick the Yellow was placed on the semi-limited list was because of its interactions with Makura, which they had also banned in this exact same ban list, which means there was no way to even use its combo. It would have made sense for them to semi-limit this card if Makura was still a live card in the game, but it wasn't. So technically, there was no reason to put this card on the ban list at all, since it wasn't useful outside of that combo, which is why this card was immediately taken off the ban list in the very next format, and why it has never since been put back on the ban list, since Makura the Destructor is one of the most broken cards in the game and will never come off the ban list. So while a lot of the other cards on this list kind of had reasons why they were put on the ban list, even if most of them seemed to be an overreaction, Chick the Yellow is the only one that did not really need to be put on the ban list at all, while also being a kind of obscure card that was never very good anyway on its own, which is why I think it should take the number 1 spot on this list. The Forbidden and Limited list is how Konami has dealt with cards that are too powerful or too problematic to exist in Yu-Gi-Oh's metagame, with the Forbidden, often referred to as banned, cards being the worst offenders. But Konami doesn't just ban cards. Given enough time, they frequently unban cards that were once a problem but later deemed to be okay to return to the game. Today we'll be going over some of the best cards in the game that have been unbanned, why they're so good still, and why it was okay to unban them. And kicking off this at number 10, we have Substitoad. This is the level 1 Aqua monster, which you contribute 1 monster you control to special summon any frog monster from your deck. Also, frog monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. These effects exclude Frog the Jam because it only has frog in its name in the TCG as a translation error. So why was Substitoad banned? Well, despite not technically being a frog itself, the frog engine is one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most powerful combinations of monsters ever. Before it was banned, Substitoad was the cornerstone of the deck, able to cycle through every playable frog and sometimes somewhat unplayable frog monster in your deck, giving you loads of materials off of the pleasant effects from cards like Swap Frog and Rodent Totem. It's self-accessible by Swap Frog since it isn't technically a frog for Substitoad. This came to define multiple formats, most infamously with Frog FTK, the deck that sought to abuse the lack of a once-per-turnable Substitoad and Rodent Toad to revive 20 pieces of materials for a Mass Driver, killing your opponent on turn 1. And while it may seem like the banning a Mass Driver as an FTK enabler would have fixed the issue, the Frog engine itself was still incredibly powerful for its time. It still generated an absurd amount of resources by abusing cards like Salvage and Maria of Gree, and it still dominated the battle phase with Dupe Frog locking your opponent out of attacking. And even without the FTK shenanigans, the deck still had powerful turn 1 capabilities, which were not common back when Substitoad was still legal. Even without Mass Driver, the engine and deck were too powerful, and Substitoad had to be locked up. So why did Konami unban it if it's so powerful? Well, frankly, they couldn't. But what they could do was ban Ronin Toten, the other broken part of what Subsitoad was capable of. This was in part because of Swap Frog and Ronin Toten being directly powerful as a supporting level 2 engine in Sprite decks, and banning Ronin Toten was used as a way to weaken Sprite. And with Ronin Toten going on the list, suddenly all of the abuse cases with Subsitoad disappeared. It's like how Wind Up Hunter is insanely broken and capable of hand looping people if there's an engine to support it, but okay to keep legal so as long as Wind Up Zenmaity is banned, since Zenmaity was the entire engine. Subsitoad and Ronin Toten can't be legal at the same time, but if Ronin Toten is ban-worthy for other reasons, bringing Subsitoad back is perfectly fine, just so long as they don't print anything that lets Subsitoad abuse its lack of a hard once per turn again in the future. Subsitoad is the only card on this list that sees absolutely no play since its unbanning, but it's arguably the historically most powerful card outside of that, earning its place off that distinction. And at number 9 on this list, we have Gateway of the Six. This is a continuous spell that adds 2 counters called Bushido counters to itself every time you normal or special summon a 6 samurai monster, and you can spend those counters to activate one of its 3 effects. For 2 counters, you can give a 6 samurai or Shien monster you control 500 attack points for the rest of the turn. For 4 counters, you can add a 6 samurai monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand. And for 6 counters, you can target a Shien effect monster in your graveyard and special summon it. Gateway of the Six is arguably one of the most broken continuous spells ever, even making it to the top 10 of our list of the best continuous spells ever. While its first and third effects have niche uses, it's really the second effect that causes problems. The ability to continuously add cards for summoning your archetype's monsters, which the deck does anyhow, and doing so without a hard once per turn, creates a positive feedback loop, where the more monsters you summon, the more you add and get to summon again. This pairs well with the special summoning capabilities like Grandmaster the 6 Samurai or Legendary 6 Samurai Kizan, who also had no hard once per turns on their ability to special summon themselves to the field if you have another 6 Samurai out, though you were limited to 1 Grandmaster on the field at a time. Still, this capability means that you could summon any 6 Samurai, special summon one of these, and suddenly you have 4 counters and can go search another. 2 gateways makes the deck go functionally infinite, as you can add a monster every time you summon a monster, and since it pulls from the graveyard, so as long as you're using these bodies as materials, even if you get every one out of your deck, you can keep adding the ones back you already used. This card instantly propelled 6 Samurai to a top deck of its era. It even transitioned well into the synchro-dominated formats thanks to the deck having one of the first boss monsters with a powerful negation effect in Legendary 6 Samurai Shien. The absurd power of multiple gateways and real boss monsters earned gateway limitation at first, but then once the XC's era kicked off and rank 3 and 4 strategies became all the rage, suddenly 6 Samurai's ability to functionally make as many rank 3s and 4s as you want, if it drew the gateway, became too sacky and problematic, earning it a ban. So, why did it get unbanned? The short answer is power creep. Not for Gateway itself, but for 6 Samurais as a whole. The 6 Samurai monsters, while great at spamming bodies in the field, aren't strong enough to carry a deck when it doesn't have Gateway access. And while the deck these days can somewhat consistently search its 1 copy of Gateway, thanks to the legacy support link monster Battle Shogun of the 6 Samurai, it's still too fragile getting to that point and following up. And frankly, if your deck can put 2 warrior monsters on the field to make Battle Shogun, you could already do something broken with the other Link 2 monster Isolde, defeating the whole purpose. The deck's explosiveness with Gateway is still legendary, being known even in modern formats as a terrifying, if fragile, combo deck that can make unbeatable boards or FTK you. But that's not enough to carry the rest of the deck's weaker cards. Gateway itself is immensely, unreasonably powerful. If any other modern archetype had a card like Gateway supporting good monsters, it would instantly deserve a ban. The only thing holding Gateway the 6 Samurai back is the 6 Samurais themselves. And at number 8 on this list, we have Performer Pal Monkey Board. This is a level 6 Earth Beast monster with a pendulum scale of 1. Like most pendulums, it has an effect which splits between its pendulum and monster modes. Its pendulum effects are, if you have another Performer Pal card in the other pendulum zone, Monkey Board's scale changes from 1 to 4. Also, during the main phase of the turn that you activate Monkey Board as a pendulum, you can add a level 4 lower Performer Pal monster from your deck to your hand. Monkey Board's monster effect is to discard itself and reveal Performer Pal or Odd Eyes in your hand, which lets you reduce that monster's level by 1 in your hand for the rest of the turn, even after summoning them. This extends to other copies of the same monster too. Performer Pal Monkey Board is the cornerstone of the infamous Tier 0 Perform Mage Performer Pal Pendulum deck, or Pepe for short. One of the most dominant decks in history that, while we're on the topic of ban lists, was one of the only decks ever to motivate Konami to make an emergency ban list to deal with the overwhelming dominance of the deck. While Monkey Board isn't the only broken monster in the deck, it is the most important consistency piece. The main thing Monkey Board did in an era filled with pendulum monsters was work as a 1-card setup for your scales. Pendulum's biggest inherent problem is every hand needs a way to get two monsters with different pendulum scales somehow to enable pendulum summons. And Monkey Board did this with a single copy by searching out other performer pals for scales, usually Lizard Draw or Guitar Turtle for card draw, but also just being able to add the deck's best normal summon, performer pal Skullcrab Joker to hand to summon anyhow. The main issue is that Monkey Board was a searcher that then doubled as a pendulum scale, both to pendulum summon later or as a material for the effect of a card like Wavering Eyes to further sculpt your hand. Pepe was renowned for its ability to put up an absurd number of bodies and powerful boss monsters, most notably at the time Cyber Dragon Infinity, while also having functionally infinite follow-up with Monkey Board being the centerpiece of the most dominant pendulum deck ever. So why did they unban it? Much like Gateway the Six, time had passed and left both performer pals and generally pendulums as a whole as not quite good enough for modern play. While Monkey Board is a one-card scale and could make some minor one-card combos, with its friend Plushfire still banned, the incredible ceiling of performer pals is much lower. Monkey Board, even at one copy, is still a good card and has seen play in recent times alongside the Draco Slayer retrained pendulums. As in a pendulum deck, a one-card scale is still solid. The deck itself tops out as a rogue strategy where Monkey Board only serves to provide a little extra material to a more powerful, but still not top tier, archetype. Maybe Monkey Board still had its partner in crime in Plushfire, it could be higher this list, much like Subsitoad, but as it stands, it's still just a pretty good card going up against a field of much stronger cards. With how well pendulum archetypes work together, Monkey Board has a lot of potential to be good in the future if any new powerful pendulum strategies arise. So keep an eye out for this once banned monster. And at number 7 on this list, we have the Phantom Knights of Rusty Bardiche. This is a Link 3 Dark Warrior monster that requires 2 or more Dark monsters as materials. Rusty cannot be used as a Link material itself. Once during your main phase, Rusty Bardiche lets you send one Phantom Knights monster from your deck to the graveyard to set a Phantom Knight spell or trap card from your deck to the field. Rusty Bardiche also allows you to target and destroy any card in the field if a Dark Xyz monster is special summoned to a zone it points to. Rusty Bardiche is an incredibly loaded card effect-wise. The unifying card in the Phantom Knights archetype, Resolving Rusty represents 2 monster negates thanks to being able to directly search Fogblade, as well as a second copy of the Phantom Knights of Silent Boots, which can balance itself to get you a second Fogblade. This little interaction made Rusty a cornerstone of dozens of different dark-centric decks and archetypes, from Spirals to Dangers to Lunalights and Orcus. There was a time where basically every deck in the format was cramming in a copy of Rusty, Boots, and some Fogblades to turn all of those easy Dark Link materials into powerful interaction. Not only that, Rusty Bardiche also lets you convert a Link monster into a rank 4 thanks to being able to search out the Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine, and potentially, but not always necessary, the Phantom Knights of Stained Greaves off of Ascent Ancient Cloak. This was most famously used for Time Thief Redoer and to set up the infamous Outer Entity Azathoth. Itself a banned card for many reasons, but most painfully from Rusty's unique ability to search a quick play rank up spell in the Phantom Knights rank up magic launch, letting you lock out your opponent the monster effects on their turn by ranking up into Redoer into an Azathoth. All these amazing uses, all this power, all in a relatively generic package. Even its second effect to destroy other cards has decent utility, as a lot of decks that use it had good Xyz access to monsters like the aforementioned Time Thief Redoer or Raider's Knight. Clearly an amazing card. So why did they unban it? Well, first, Azathoth being banned after Rusty's initial banning helped, as the card was broken anyhow and is one of the reasons Rusty got banned, though Rusty did stay banned for its generic splash ability even after Azathoth was gone. But the main reason is that, much like Gateway of the Six Samurai, the entire Phantom Knights engine slowly became irrelevant. The archetype itself isn't bad, like the Six Samurai are, as they are relatively competent to modern deck and design, but long gone are the days where other decks were splashing Rusty for 2 monster negates, as most modern power archetypes tend to not need that kind of interaction. It's still a popular and archetype-defining monster for the Phantom Knights themselves, and the deck was fighting for tiered metagame relevance as recently as 2022. But even in a world where the Phantom Knights are a great deck, that's not necessarily a good reason for Rusty to stay on the ban list anymore. Despite being generic, he's not as powerful as the truly broken generic Link monsters still on the ban list. Looking at you, Halgi5rax. But Rusty is still an awesome and powerful monster, so it lands itself on this list as a great unbanned card. And at number 6, we have Evil Swarm Exciton Knight. This is a rank 4 light fee monster that requires any 2 level 4 monsters as its materials, and a once per chain effect where during either your main phase or your opponent's battle phase, you can attach 1 material from Exciton Knight to destroy all other cards in the field. But your opponent must have more total cards in their hand on the side of the field than you do, and they take no more damage for the rest of the turn. Evil Swarm Exciton Knight is one of the most powerful Xyz monsters ever. While Black Rose Dragon was the original meta board wipe monster in the extra deck, Exciton Knight took the concept to another level, sticking around afterwards as a threat and even being able to use the effect again, since it only cost 1 of its 2 materials. It also helps that, as a summoning requirement, rank 4s are some of the most accessible extra deck monsters available, due to the vast array of support it has. And during the Zexal era, where everything was about rank 4s, Excited Knight was basically in every deck that could use the extra deck. Even decks that weren't primarily rank 4 strategies like Cosmo or Infernoids would play Excited Knight on the off chance they ended up with level 4s on the field, because its effect was just so powerful. So long as Exciton was around, very few board states were safe. It wasn't just ubiquitous, but usually decided games. If one player can activate an Excited Knight online and clear the board, then follow up themselves, it was almost always a win. For the first 2 years of its legality, it was arguably the best extra deck monster of its era, before getting banned in late 2015 as its board wiping capabilities was even swingier in pendulum formats, clearing your opponent's skills before committing to your own and setting up. So if Excited Knight is so great at swinging games, why was it unbanned? Well, Excited Knight's time on the ban list was relatively short, coming back off the list a little over 2 years later. And it wasn't a huge problem initially thanks to the advent of Link Summoning and Master Rule 4. This general hyper-focus on Link monsters and the weakening of other extra deck mechanics like Xyz summoning made room for Exciton's return. And since then, power creep took hold and even more powerful board clearing tools have been released. Excited Knight is good, but it doesn't really compare to cards like Axis Kotaker, who clears boards and delivers lethal pushes, or Zeus, arguably the best board clearing monster ever, who really leaps over Excited Knight in its ease of summoning and its unconditional quick effect board wipe. Still, Excited Knight stands as a great card to this day for decks that have rank 4 access. It has seen consistent play in any deck with a strong rank 4 engine ever since it came back to the game, with recent inclusion in meta decks like Nichiria, Super Heavy Samurai, and even Ishizu tier limit decks, thanks to both halves of that tier 0 strategy enabling rank 4s. A complete board wipe is hard to truly power creep, and so long as rank 4 access is a mainstay of some competitive decks, expect to see Excited Knight making itself known for the foreseeable future. And at number 5, we have Destrudo, the Lost Dragon's Frizzen. This is a level 7 Dark Dragon tuner. Destrudo can summon itself from either your hand or graveyard by paying half your life points and targeting a level 6 or lower monster you control, reducing Destrudo's level by the level of that monster, and then summoning to the field. So if you target a level 3 monster, Destrudo summons itself as being a level 7 minus 3, making it level 4. If Destrudo leaves the field after using this effect, you place it on the bottom of your deck instead. Destrudo is one of the absolute best tuners ever printed. Its ability to automatically generate a level 7 synchro when paired with any other low-level monster has made it instrumental in a number of decks. Dozens of different archetypes use it to access all sorts of different monsters. Spirals use it to make pre-errata Ancient Fairy Dragon, who could destroy its Spiral Resort to search a second copy and abuse its lack of a once per turn. It was common to see it paired in decks that can make use of Yazi Evil Liang Xing, whether to summon a powerful extender like Mare and set up a full Danglon combo, a card that deserves an honorable mention itself on its list. It was even used as just a generic dark monster that could spell summon itself in the several decks that use dangers, getting instant value when discarded. You might think that's why it was banned. If nearly every deck is playing it, that's often a good enough reason to see it banned, right? Well, not really. The reason Destrudo got banned was because of another card's new release, and that card was Crystron Halki-Fibrax. Destrudo was one of the few monsters, including Jet Synchron, Glow Up Bulb, and Blackwing Steam the Cloak, that were banned purely because they made it a bit too easy for any deck to access Halki-Fibrax off of minimal commitment. Each of these cards were pretty good in their own right, but Destrudo was particularly easy to do it with, thanks to being searchable by Dragon Ravine, itself searchable by Dragon Knight Romulus. Any deck could just splash or easily search to access one of the most broken combo creators in the game with Halki-Fibrax, which got quickly banned after its release because banning the shiny new Link monster wasn't really an option at the time. So why did they unban Destrudo? Well, because Halki-Fibrax earned its ban regardless of whether a card like Destrudo was in the format or not. Turns out it was broken for a variety of other reasons, and this let Destrudo, as well as its fellow victim and honorable mention Jet Synchron, off the ban list eventually. Destrudo stands out as the generically best of these group of monsters, and instantly started seeing play again after its unbanning. It was a mainstay of danger decks again on top of the punk variants that love a relatively low-cost synchro extender. Destrudo is especially great in modern Tearlament decks, who also sometimes run punk and danger engines, and Tearlaments can't help but love a powerful extender out of the graveyard to hit with their mass milling. And even after several bans were weakening Tearlaments, it's still playable to this day as a meta-relevant deck that's running this dragon. Destrudo is just one of the most versatile and splashable monsters in the history of the game. It was probably never powerful enough to deserve a ban, and only received one incidentally. But it stood the test of time to remain relevant after its unbanning, and is undoubtedly an extremely powerful monster. Arising from the dead number 4, we have Monster Reborn. This is a spell card which simply states that you can spell summon a monster from either player's graveyard to your side of the field. Monster Reborn is one of the most ubiquitous spells in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! existing ever since the TCG existed with the original release of the Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon pack and appearing several times in the anime itself. And it was instantly one of the best cards in the game. In early Yu-Gi-Oh!, the game was slow enough that there was very little special summoning, and the game was a back and forth battle of card resources and removal. Monster Reborn letting you revive the best monster in these long grind games made it one of the best cards for pushing for damage, or getting a strong board presence. It wasn't long before the lack of any cost made Monster Reborn extra exploitable. Cards like Magician of Faith getting it back made it so that this small burst of tempo and power could cascade into something bigger. And when Dark Magician of Chaos released and its original ability to instantly recur a spell card, suddenly looping Monster Reborn several times for one turn kill wasn't that unusual. Monster Reborn was one of the original limited cards, and eventually it was part of the first ban list alongside other major culprits for warping the game too much. So why was this old school, costless, overpowered spell banned? An interesting thing about Monster Reborn is that, as special summon became more common, it was often looked at as one of the original bans most likely to come off of the ban list with minimal problems. This amusingly led to Monster Reborn becoming unbanned and banned 3 times before the 4th unbanning stuck in 2017. Most of the time, the Reborn effect was just still too good for too many different reasons, heightening the ceiling of too many combo decks or minimizing the removal of big threats. A funny comparison is that a very similar card, Premature Burial, is still on the list despite being limited to just your own graveyard and costing life points to use. The problem with Premature Burial is both its searchability as an equip card, and it could be bounced and looped multiple times a turn. One of the original things that got Monster Reborn banned, but those perpetrators ended up getting erratas or becoming too slow. Still, despite being safely off the ban list for years, the card has been great in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Tons of combo decks looking for great extenders like Adamantipator or Dragon Link play it as they love working out of the graveyard. It even has some very effective utility against generic modern board breaker monsters that tons of decks splash, like how Cast Your Fenrir is playable in basically every deck. Killing your opponent's Fenrir, reborning it, then searching yourself your own Fenrir out of your deck is a fairly familiar play for any deck of Monster Reborn in the modern meta. Monster Reborn has always been a great card, no matter how fast or slow the format is. Sometimes ban-worthy, always good, it's an easy choice for one of the best previously banned cards in the game today. Striking it big at number 3 in this list, we have Raigeki. This is a spell card that simply destroys all monsters your opponent controls. Much like Monster Reborn, Raigeki is one of the most iconic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, with major appearances at all levels of the game from competitive to the playground. Another all-star card printed in the first set, Raigeki is also one of the original cards to be placed on the first ban list. Both it and Dark Hole were far too powerful in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, creating catastrophic swings in resources when taking out multiple monsters on your opponent's side of the field at the cost of just one card for yourself. Early Yu-Gi-Oh! Was completely defined by resource management and haymaker effects like this to get ahead in the game. So why was such a clearly great card allowed off the ban list? Well, for a very long time, it wasn't. But when Dark Hole came off the list in 2010, it set the stage for Raigeki. While Dark Hole was a mainstay in decks for years up to that point, these mass destruction effects weren't as game warping as they had been in the past. With the rise of destruction-resistant boss monsters and negation effects to protect against powerful board-breaking spells, these pieces of mass removal were great, but still answerable. Not to mention that, unlike in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, a lot of modern monsters can net you value when destroyed by card effect. And a big deal with why Raigeki was banned in the first place is it punished slower flip effect monsters, or the slower recruiters that were important to the game back then, but long since made irrelevant by today. And while it might seem ridiculous to think you could power creep a card that destroys every monster your opponent controls, with the release of effects like Evenly Match or Lightning Storm that can answer both monsters in back row, a less versatile card like Raigeki, while still good, wasn't a sacky card that was impossible to replicate elsewhere. This isn't really meant to downplay Raigeki entirely as a card. After all, it's still very flexible in the sense that you can play it after you've partly established your board, unlike Lightning Storm, with its no face-up cards restrictions, or Raigeki's sibling card Dark Hole that destroys your own monsters as well. Or can still use your battle phase afterwards, unlike Evenly Match. So in a deck that has powerful monsters that can hit the field and bait out negations to clear the way, Raigeki is undoubtedly the best card in those situations at cleaning up any more monsters. Or if your deck has monsters in it that it can draw cards after hitting the field, Raigeki is a card that you can dig for with card effects without fear of turning off your critical board breakers. At the end of the day, Raigeki is a superlative going second card, and it's still one of the best board breakers in the game. But, unlike when it was banned, there's more competition for the role, letting Raigeki exist as one of the most powerful spells in the game, but safe enough to keep unbanned. Next up at number 2 in this list, we have Harpy's Feather Duster. This spell destroys all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. Harpy's Feather Duster is the spell and trap card equivalent of Raigeki, and it has almost all of the same parallels. It was a member of the original ban list, though unlike Raigeki and Dark Hole, Duster's Destroy All Other Counterpart Heavy Storm was not banned on the first list. but would later become banned and stay there. This dichotomy is part of what makes Feather Duster a more significant card than Raigeki, as there are fewer alternatives to it. While Lightning Storm and Evenly Match can both deal back row cards, if you needed something without their restrictions, you don't have 3 copies of Heavy Storm like you do Dark Hole to fall back on in a world without Duster. So if Heavy Storm is still banned, why did they let Feather Duster go free? Well, Heavy Storm technically has some potentially exploitable interactions in destroying your own cards. There are certain spell and trap cards that you want in your graveyard or want actively destroyed, like the True Drago cards, the Unchained Traps, or basically every tier limit spell and trap. All could let you set up your combos while clearing back row. Harpy's Feather Duster still has incredible power as a back row clearing blowout, but isn't quite as exploitable as Heavy Storm or even the also forbidden Giant Trunade, long since banned for recurring your own spell and trap cards that lack hard once per turns and looping for insane value while doubling as back row hate. Before Feather Duster came off the list, the next best back row removal card not mentioned was Twin Twisters, a solid card in its own right, with its quick play nature sometimes making it a bit better against certain threats. But the discard was a steep price to pay, and it can never be as purely impactful as a result Feather Duster can be at its best. Not only does fewer and weaker alternatives make Harpy's Feather Duster stand out, there's also fewer spells and traps that resist getting destroyed. While tons of monsters shrug off or get value off of being destroyed by Raigeki, back row rarely has this kind of built-in defense against a sweeping effect. Technically, a card like Solemn Judgment can protect the rest of your spells and traps, but that usually requires hard drawing it instead of doing consistent combo for a resilient boss monster, making Harpy's Feather Duster much better when it is relevant. Even decks that do search back row negation effects often only do so as the main piece of interaction in their setup, so Feather Duster often gets the job done even when negated. Harpy's Feather Duster is one of the most played sideboard cards in the game, and is often so good that it's often the only going second spell and trap hate that players are willing to main deck despite doing nothing on turn 1. Especially with the existence of Triple Tactics Thrust even making it searchable. More and more decks are getting powerful field spells that double as interaction, or even have continuous spells or traps that gain absolutely bonkers value. That just having access to this card in any game isn't always bad. Despite being largely defined as a going second card in a game where going first is almost always best, Harpy's Feather Duster is just too good at what it does to ignore. And finally, at number 1 on this list, we have Change of Heart. This spell lets you target one monster your opponent controls and take control of it until the end of the turn. Another member of the original ban list crew alongside the previous 3 entries, Change of Heart is the most recently unbanned card on this list, and for good reason. Taking control of one of your opponent's monsters is one of the most powerful forms of board breaking possible. Not only does it remove a threat, but frequently you're getting a monster that has an interaction of some kind that you can leverage for both breaking the board or continuing your own plays. In the early days, it was one of the best ways to push for lethal damage alongside cards like Monster Reborn, and it had double utility of letting you take control of your opponent's monsters and using it for tribute summons for something like a Monarch or a Jinzo, or other good tribute monsters from back when tributing summoning was relevant. And sometimes you could get even further ahead by taking your opponent's Magician of Faith and recurring your Change of Heart, removing the cost. This kind of power and utility earned Change of Heart one of the longest stays on the ban list of any card. It's similar to Monster Reborn in that it also has a pseudo-doppelganger equip card, Snatch Steal, which was still banned until very recently. And just like Premature Burial, the main reason is that equip cards have exploitable synergies that make a super powerful generic option dangerous. They actually tried to unban Snatch Steal once before, and on the very next list banned it again because it was a huge mistake at the time. And Snatch Steal has the added benefit of being a permanent steal instead of a temporary one. Change of Heart is arguably better in past scenarios since it can take face down monsters, but that's not too relevant in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So why was it safe to unban? A lot of the people weren't sure it was at the time. But much like the previous entries on this list, there were already some cards in the format that worked about just as well as Change of Heart already. The most obvious one is Mind Control, which has the same effect but with the minor restriction of being unable to tribute or attack with the monster. There's also Triple Tactics Talents, which has 3 modes, simulating Pot of Greed, the Forceful Sentry, but with an even more powerful emulation of Change of Heart's effect as it doesn't target when it takes a monster. But Change of Heart is still better in a lot of situations than these 2 limitations. Mind Control is strictly worse, and the inability to attack is a huge deal given the existence of cards like Kashtira Fenrir in the game. As mentioned with Monster Reborn, taking your opponent's Fenrir can plus you and break your opponent's board wide open, but you need to be able to attack to do it. And Triple Tactics Talents, while it is an all-star card ever since its printing, does need an opponent's monster's effect to activate in the main phase to even be online. Change of Heart gives you this insanely powerful effect in a completely straightforward way. No downsides, just power. Ever since it came off the list, it's been a staple sideboard card, and as of this video, it has been so good as to be even main deckable for this past year's metagames thanks to decks like Kashtira and Unchained being the top decks throughout the year that Change of Heart is incredible against. And while there were other ways to do a similar job, Mind Control also had limitations like Change of Heart, and Talent isn't as reliable, making Change of Heart's effect and ease of use significantly more unique than the previous DM era spells in this list. It was on the ban list for the longest of any card here because it was the best card that was still worthy of being unbanned, and that earns it its distinction of the best unbanned card in the game. Yugioh is the name of the anime character from the first series who has a duel against Seto Kaiba, who doesn't really have any other duels in the series. The cards she uses are all vanilla monsters with no effects, and Konami basically printed every single card that appears in her deck into the actual game, albeit with changed effects. In order to go over all the cards in this video, I think we should first recap the duel real quick, because it'll make a lot of sense why they created some future support cards for the Yugioh cards, which is the unofficial name for this series of cards that we're going to be going over in this video. Yugioh starts off the duel with the drag down to the grave, summons Keldo, which promptly gets destroyed, uses Swords of Revealing Light to stall for 3 turns, sets Exchange of the Spirit, then Kaiba destroys her deck with both Crush Card Virus and Virus Cannon, which are both much stronger than the animated version and the real life versions, which basically gets rid of all of her monsters with more than 1500 attack and 10 spells from her deck. Then, after her deck is destroyed, she uses Exchange of the Spirit, which swaps both players' graveyards with their deck, giving Kaiba only 6 cards left. Then she uses Muko twice in order to deny 2 of his draws, and slowly summons Kelbeck, Zulga, and Yugioh over the course of 3 turns. Then Kaiba sets Soul Exchange in order to confusingly use it on his opponent's turn, even though it's a normal spell card, they just kind of ignore this, in order to tribute those 3 cards in order to bring out Obelisk from his hand. However, Yugioh had booby-trapped Zulga with a trap card she didn't have to actually flip face up, so that if a monster that tributed Zulga declares an attack, he would be destroyed and inflict damage equal to its attack to its owner. However, on Kaiba's turn, instead of attacking with Obelisk, he uses Silent Doom to bring out a monster. Then tributes both the God card and the new monster to bring out a Blue Eyes White Dragon, which he then uses to attack with in order to win. So, keep all this in mind as we go over the plethora of support that the Yugioh cards received over the years. In 2003, the set Dark Crisis was released in the TCG, and with this set, we received the first round of the Yugioh cards. First up, we have Mudora. This card was changed from Vanilla Monster in the anime to an effect monster that has the ability where it gains 200 attack for each fairy monster in your graveyard. So, how strong was Mudora during its time period? Well, to give some context, the card Breaker the Magical Warrior was released in the previous set, which has 1600 attack, immediately goes up to 1900 when it's summoned and places a spell counter on itself, and has the opportunity to remove the spell counter to destroy 1 spell trap card on the field. And Breaker was such a meta staple that it was constantly restricted on the ban list. So Mudora doesn't really stack up to Breaker on its own, and would need at least 3 fairies in the grave just to beat over Breaker the Magical Warrior's default mode. And fairy-type monsters were not really known for putting a whole bunch of cards in the graveyard outside of Shining Angel at this time period. So it's safe to say Mudora never saw any competitive play. Next up we have Keldo. This card was upgraded from vanilla in the anime to have a floating effect, where if it's destroyed by battle, you can shuffle 2 cards in your opponent's graveyard back into their deck. I have to assume this effect was given to it, seeing as it was the only card actually destroyed by battle during the duel, and of course the theme of shuffling the graveyard back into the deck was kind of Yugioh's thing. Yugioh is a level 4 Earth Fairy monster with 1500 attack, which was given the effect that if it's destroyed by battle, you can roll a 6-sided die. Then you can special summon a fairy monster from your grave who has a level equal to the dice result, or level 6 or higher if you rolled a 6. Kelbeck is also a level 4 Earth Fairy with 1500 attack, but has 1800 defense, the highest of all the Yugioh monsters, and has the ability where if it's attacked by a monster, it returns that monster to the hand after damage calculation. And finally, we have Zulga, another level 4 Earth Fairy, this time with 1700 attack, which is actually decent, and it has the effect that if it's tributed for a tribute summon, you gain 2000 life points. Out of the 5 level 4 Earth Fairy monsters that make up the Yugioh monsters, not a single one of them saw any kind of competitive play. They were all kind of a little bit too low statted for the time period that they came out, back when their stats really mattered in level 4 monsters. And also, all of their effects were just kind of bad. Fairies did not have enough support to make Mudora have a high enough attack power. Keldo's effect to return cards from the graveyard was just too slow because it needed to be destroyed by battle, even if it was technically useful. Yugioh's effect was basically a joke for how bad it was, and only Kelbeck and Zulga had halfway decent effects. Being able to bounce a monster that attacks Kelbeck is decent, as this was an effect tied to Wall of Illusion, which did see competitive play, and had basically the same effect. However, Wall of Illusion had 50 more defense, which was really a world of difference from 1800, because that was kind of the threshold on a decently statted monster. To put that into perspective, if Kelbeck simply had 1900 defense instead of 1800, it probably would have seen competitive play. But since it was only 1800, it was just not good enough because it would be destroyed by pretty much anything decent. And with Zulga, while tributes were used at the time, Generally, the best cards to tribute were ones that special summon themselves in some way, which Zulga did not. Also, getting life points was just not a good effect even in early Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you went through the effort to try to tribute summon using Zulga, there wasn't really a payoff for it. One has to wonder why they gave the Ishizu cards such mediocre effects, when they might have actually been better if they were just left as normal monsters, because then they at least would benefit from normal monster support. These cards were just beyond awful. They didn't work together in any cohesive way, and didn't even really have support, since Earth Fairies were just kind of not a thing, as most support for fairy monsters was generally tied to the light attribute. However, the spells and traps are a little bit different, as some of them did see competitive play. Also in Dark Crisis, alongside the Ishizu monsters, were the Ishizu spells and traps, which also did not share a theme because the archetypes didn't really exist back then. In fact, the pack that included the Ishizu monsters included one of the very first archetypes in the game, that being the Archfiends. First up, we have Cestus of Dagla. This is an equip spell which can only be equipped to a fairy, which gives it 500 attack. In addition, if it deals any damage to your opponent, you gain life points equal to the damage inflicted. One has to wonder why they have so many life point gain cards in an archetype dedicated to a character who only wanted to deal burn damage. Drag Down to the Grave was also released at this time, but was heavily nerfed from its anime counterpart. What it does is allow both players to reveal their hands, then each player chooses one card from their opponent's hand in order to send to the graveyard. Then both players draw one card. In the anime, it chose 2 cards instead of 1, which would have been kind of insane because Drag Down to the Grave has actually seen competitive play over the years, and probably would have been banned if it did select 2 cards instead of 1. Blast Held by a Tribute is a battle trap which can only be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack that was tribute summoned, in which case you destroy all of your opponent's face-up attack position monsters, then inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent. So it's basically like a Mirror Force that also deals a little bit of burn damage, which actually made this card really good in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, when Mirror Force was still not in the game, and tribute summoning was a normal part of the game as well. However, in the actual TCG, it wasn't even used as a side deck option, because there were just better staple spells and traps to use instead. Of the 3 Ishizu spells and traps, only Drag Down to the Grave has been useful over the years, mainly used with Dark World decks, as it was a great way to trigger the Dark World effects in hand in order to be discarded by a card effect, while also getting rid of choice cards in your opponent's hand in the process. The way you would use it was basically set all your good cards in the field, that way you only had Dark Worlds in your hand, which would all trigger when they were sent to the graveyard. Then your opponent's hand would be ripe for the taking. In fact, Drag Down to the Grave was also used in just normal meta decks during Master Rule 4, because the speed of the game finally got to a point where players had multiple one-card starters. So they would just use Drag Down to the Grave in order to look at their opponent's hand and get rid of a hand trap that would stop their plays, and just wouldn't care which card of theirs was discarded from their hand because their entire hand could start their combo. Next up, we have Muko. This is a trap card which can only be activated if an effect activates, which allows people to draw cards, in which case both players get to see the cards drawn and then send them all to the graveyard. In the anime, this card worked more like drop-off, as it was just sending the cards they drew immediately to the graveyard without any other kind of effects. Also, fun story about Muko is that when it was first translated into the West, it was actually named Null and Void. And in fact, if you find any copies of this card, that's still its name, as it hasn't actually been reprinted since its name was changed to Muko. Null and Void actually came out after the initial wave of Ishizu cards in 2004, and no other Ishizu cards were released until 2005. And finally, we have Exchange of the Spirit. This card was released as a promo and then later on in the year released in a pack, which has the effect that if you have 15 or more cards in your grave, you can pay 1000 life points in order to swap both players' decks with their graveyard. And in its original effect, this was one of the most broken cards in the game. And the reason for that was it was one of the easiest ways to mill your opponent's deck in one turn with one card. You see, there are a plethora of cards which allow you to draw cards from your deck. So if you simply play a deck full of draw cards, or waste a cycle through your deck, you would eventually get 15 of them into the graveyard while doing this, and eventually find one of your copies of Exchange of the Spirit, in which case you just pass to your opponent, immediately activate the card during the draw phase, and completely deck out your opponent, since they wouldn't have any cards in the graveyard yet. Then you would just have to not lose that turn, and then you'd be able to win on your opponent's next turn. And in fact, in no ban list tournaments, this was the fastest way to win in one turn alongside Mercure the Destructor and Temple of the Kinks, allowing you to activate trap cards from your hand. Exchange of the Spirit was then promptly banned and stayed banned until it received an errata. The errata was twofold. First, they made it so both players need to have 15 or more cards in the graveyard to use it, then they gave it a once per duel clause on top of it. Since both players needed 15 cards in the grave to use it now, if you use the effect when your opponent had exactly 15 cards in the graveyard, that means they would still have 15 cards left in their deck and no longer be instantly decked out as soon as you got 15 cards in your grave, which basically turned it from an overpowered juggernaut of a card to a funny card you might be able to use to FTK with if you get your opponent's entire deck into the graveyard and then swap it. Basically, the card wasn't really played competitively anymore. But for a short time, this was one of the strongest cards in the game, and still is considered a very strong card in its pre-eroded version. And with Exchange of the Spirit, this is every single card which was shown in the anime that Ishizu played, having all of them put into the real game, with one of them even breaking the game a little bit. Then, randomly in 2021, Zolga got a retrain. It was given the exact same stats as the original, but with an entirely new effect and a slightly different name, as it was now called Zolga the Prophet. And it was given 3 effects, all of which are more in line with its anime version, and no longer being tied to life point gain. First off, it could special summon itself from your hand if you controlled an Earth Fairy. Next, when it's special summoned, you can look at the top 5 cards of both players' decks. And finally, if this card was used as a tribute for a monster, and that tribute summon monster declares an attack, you can banish this card from your graveyard to destroy that monster and deal 2,000 points of damage to your opponent. So, first of all, they finally fixed the part of this card that made it bad in the real game. In that, it was a monster with an effect tied to being tributed for a tribute summon, but could not special summon itself. Also, it finally dealt damage to your opponent, which is more in line with the anime version of the card, but only deals 2,000 points of damage instead of the full attack of the monster, to, I guess, pay tribute to its old version of the card, which gained you 2,000 life points. And finally, it lets you look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, which is just a nod to the anime and how Ishizu always knew which cards were being drawn because of her ability to see into the future. And since you could see the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck, you now knew exactly the next 5 cards they would draw. Now, when Zolga the Prophet was released, people were kind of perplexed as to why they only retrained one of the 5 Ishizu monsters, because it seemed kind of random. Well, don't worry, they were just cooking in the oven a little bit, as they definitely would be retrained as well really soon. In the meantime, Zolga the Prophet saw absolutely no competitive play, but at least it was no longer an awful card. Later in 2021, they released a whole bunch of God card support, including the card Soul Crossing. This is a quick play spell card which allows you to tribute 3 monsters in both players' fields in order to summon a God card from your hand. And in the artwork, you can see Kelbeck, Agito, and Zolga, as they were the 3 cards used by Kaiba in order to summon out Opposite Tormentor. However, they finally created a card that allows you to do what he did in the anime. As in the anime, he just used Soul Exchange during his opponent's turn, which doesn't work that way. And also only allows you to use 1 monster to tribute and not 3. Then, at the tail end of 2022, Konami finally released a brand new set of Ishizu cards, basically retraining the rest of them, and made them just a tiny bit better than Zolga. First up, we have Mudora the Sword Oracle. It has the same stats as the original, and none of its original effects. All of these new retrained Ishizu monsters have 2 effects, with 2 parts to each of those effects. The first one of Mudora is that you can discard 1 Earth Fairy from your hand in order to special summon it from your hand. Then, place the card Gravekeeper's Trap directly from your deck into the field face up. Its second effect can be used while it's on the field or in the graveyard, where at quick effect speed, it can banish itself in order to target up to 3 cards in both players' graveyards and shuffle them back into the deck. Or if you have the trap card Exchange of the Spirit on your field or in the grave, you can instead shuffle back 5 cards. The card that starts out, Gravekeeper's Trap, has the effect where you can discard a card from your hand in order to add an Earth Fairy or Gravekeeper monster from your deck to your hand. When your opponent draws a card, you can declare a name, and if you declare the correct card they drew, it's sent to the graveyard. And finally, if you have Exchange of the Spirit in the grave, it turns into a floodgate, where your opponent can't activate card effects in the graveyard or special summon from the grave. Next up, we have Keldo the Sacred Protector. This card can also special summon itself from your hand by discarding another fairy. Then if it's summoned this way, you can add Exchange of the Spirit or a card that mentions it from your deck to your hand, which basically includes all of the new Ishizu monsters, as they all have a bonus effect if Exchange of the Spirit is in the graveyard. Where in Keldo's case, it's the exact same as Mudora, where you can banish it from the graveyard or field in order to shuffle back 3 cards from the graveyards, or 5 if Exchange of the Spirit is on the field or in the grave. Agito became Agito the Ancient Sentinel. Its special summon effect is triggered if a card is sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's graveyard, in which case you can special summon this card from your hand, then you can special summon a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your grave. This effect pays tribute to the original Agito card, which could also special summon a fairy from the graveyard, just on a much worse effect. And also, Keldo was the card that originally shuffled cards in the graveyard back into the deck. They just kind of tacked that ability onto Mudora for some reason. Anyways, Agito also has the effect where if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard in any way, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard. With its bonus effect being, if Exchange of the Spirit is in the grave, you can send 5 more cards from the top of either player's deck to the grave. Lastly, we have Kelbeck, which becomes Kelbeck the Ancient Vanguard. This card is modeled like the Agito retrain, where it special summons itself from the hand on a trigger, and also mills cards when it's sent to the graveyard. In this case, it triggers exactly the same as Agito, where if a card is sent from the hand or deck to your opponent's graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand, but only if your opponent controls a special summoned monster, which you have to bounce back to their hand. Obviously referencing its original effect, where it could bounce monsters to the hand that attacked it, which actually turned Kelbeck into a legitimate hand trap which could also just be played outside of its archetype. Additionally, if this card is sent to the graveyard from your hand or deck, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard, just like a yugioh. However, its bonus effect, if Exchange of the Spirits is in the grave, is that you can set any trap card from your graveyard to your field. There were also 2 more trap cards released: Exchange of Despair and Hope, and Blast Held by Destiny. Blast Held by Destiny is a battle trap where if a monster declares an attack, you get to destroy your opponent's highest attack monster, then both players take damage equal to that monster's attack. Or if you have Exchange of Despair in the grave, only your opponent takes the damage. Additionally, if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard in any way, you get to add a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard to your hand, which means all of your Ishizu monsters. Blast Held by Destiny finally plays proper homage to the anime version of the trap card Ishizu was trying to use, even if it was only played sometimes for its graveyard effect now. Exchange of Despair and Hope is a trap card which can only be activated if you control 3 more Earth Fairy monsters, where you send all monsters on the field to the graveyard. Then basically each player gets to special summon their opponent's monsters to the field that were sent to the graveyard. Then if Exchange of the Spirits is in the grave, you get a bonus effect to also set any trap card directly from your deck to the field, and it can be activated this turn. Now, this new wave of Ishizu monsters were insanely broken, like legitimately some of the strongest cards ever made, and were played in basically every single deck that existed in the time period in which these cards were released. And all 4 of these monsters are restricted on the ban list in some way to this day. And what was really unfortunate was they were released when tier limits were still basically at full power, which is an archetype all about milling cards from the deck to the graveyard in order to go into fusion summons, and was basically one of the strongest archetypes ever made. So when you have one of the most legitimately broken set of 4 monsters combined with one of the most overpowered archetype that directly benefits from its effects, you have a combination that is easily a tier 0 format, comprised of one of the best stacks that has ever existed, called Ishizu tier limits. In the OCG, they had no ban list tournaments during this time, where you could use any copies of any card that has ever been banned. And the deck that won the event was basically just a normal tier limits Ishizu deck. They didn't even need to use Pot of Greed because they were just so consistent without it. The Ishizu cards don't have this video for being bad, they're in this video for being so incredibly broken that they're more failures from a design standpoint, and that they were just too strong for the game. Even though this series is called Failed Cards and Mechanics and Archetypes, we should probably add designs to that as well, because that's the only place where these cards fail. Now let's talk about why this is. The 4 Ishizu monsters are categorized into the millers and the shufflers. The millers allow you to mill 10 cards every turn if you're able to hit both a yugioh and Kelbeck, and the shufflers allow you to shuffle back 6 cards every turn if you're able to hit Keldo and Mudora, because funny enough, most people did not play Exchange of the Spirit in order to gain their bonus effects. So most of the time it was these numbers that we were dealing with. In the game currently we have a card called Needlebug Nest. This is a trap card which only has the effect to send the top 5 cards of your deck to the graveyard. This card has historically seen competitive play because there are tons of good decks that have good graveyard effects, and this is one of the best ways to put 5 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard without any other kind of fuss. And this is despite the fact that it's a trap card, which means most people won't play it specifically because of that, as having to wait a turn in order to use a card is just way too slow in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a card called Transaction Rollback, which allows you to banish it from the graveyard and pay half your life points to use the effect of a normal trap card in your graveyard as its effect. And currently, tier limits are top in events using the effect to copy Needlebug Nest, because this 2-card specific combo to only mill 5 cards is so good that it's absolutely worth running. And a yugioh and Kelbeck could do this for a 1/4 of the amount of effort. You could easily get a yugioh or Kelbeck in the grave in a vast majority of ways, including during your opponent's first turn. There's a card called Herald of Orange Light, which is a hand trap that can negate and destroy a monster, but requires you to discard it with another fairy monster from your hand to use it. So, if you use it on your opponent's first turn in order to get one of their monsters and destroy it, you could also pitch a yugioh or Kelbeck if it was in your hand, in order to start the mill train and get 5 cards in the grave. Where if you then milled another one, you could mill 5 more cards and get 10 cards in your graveyard right there. Additionally, during your turn, there's a card like Diviner the Herald, which could send it directly from your deck to the graveyard, or of course a Foolish Burial, milling it incidentally with the tier limit mills, or through Mudora and Keldo, which could search them both out, as Mudora could bring out Gravekeeper's Trap, which could then search out either a yugioh or Kelbeck, and Keldo could be used to search out either a yugioh or Kelbeck, or it could search out Mudora, who can then search them out through Gravekeeper's Trap. Then, the 2 cards which you used to search out a yugioh and Kelbeck were also ridiculously good. You see, there's a card in the game called Transmigration Prophecy, which is a normal trap card which has the effect to target 2 cards in either graveyard and shuffle them both into the deck. This card was so good it was actually restricted on the ban list for a long time, and only stopped seeing play in the modern days simply because trap cards are just too slow, but the effect was always good. There's also a card in the game called DD Crow, one of the very first hand traps ever made, which simply has the effect to banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard by sending itself from your hand to the grave. And being able to disrupt a single card from your opponent's graveyard was considered so good that DD Crow has never stopped seeing competitive play since it came out. And Mudora and Keldo are both power-crept versions of the Transmigration Prophecy and DD Crow, who also could search out the overpowered millers in the process of getting themselves into the grave, and can also use their effects from the graveyard instead of having to be on the field or in the hand, which means if they're randomly milled through a yugioh or Kelback, they're live. And since they're both quick effects, you can absolutely use them in order to disrupt your opponent's graveyard plays. Mudora and Keldo are so powerful that while Ishizu was at full power, you could not play other decks that relied on the graveyard in almost any way, besides other Tearlament Ishizu decks, because Mudora and Keldo completely shut down the graveyard. In fact, even today, when both of the millers are banned and Mudora and Keldo are only available at 1 copy, they're still played quite regularly because their shuffle effects are just that overpowered. On top of it all, they're all level 4 monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand, which means you can use them to go into rank 4 Xyz's plays, who can then later on go to the graveyard to trigger their effects, except for a yugioh and Kelback who specifically have to be sent to the graveyard from your hand or deck. And this meant that if you played the Ishizu engine, you also had access to number 41 Baguska the Terrible Attired Tapir, and Abyss Dweller, 2 floodgates which could just shut down all your opponent's monsters or turn off your opponent's graveyard entirely. To give more of an indication of just how strong milling 10 cards and then being able to disrupt 6 of them is, we're going to go over a couple of very good graveyard effects. Fairy Tail Snow is a level 4 monster which can special summon itself from the graveyard by banishing 7 other cards from your hand, field, or grave. Then when it's summoned, you can book a moon in one of your opponent's cards. Destrudo, the Lost Dragon's Frozen, can special summon itself from the grave as long as you control a level 6 or lower monster, which gives you a 2-turn board to allow you to go into synchros. Rainbow Bridge of Salvation allows you to search out any field spell with its graveyard effect, and Metal Foes Fusion just straight up allows you to draw a card. Then there's really good cards which activate when they're sent to the graveyard, like all of the Tearlaments, which allow you to go into fusions and mill more. Shadow Beast will let you draw a card, Trickclown, Wolf, Felis, Dotscaper, Nightsword Serpent, and Revival Golem, which can all special summon themselves if they're sent to the graveyard, Goki Pole, which can search out Danger Mothman, Eva, which can search out Herald of Arclight, Tackle Crusader, which can book a moon a monster, and even Farfa, which can banish a monster. Then there's cards in the graveyard which can gain advantage if they're banished from the graveyard. Cards like Giant Rex, Algul Mazura, Dotscaper, DD Scoutplane, Shinobi Necro, Ascan, and Zeb, which can all special summon themselves if they're banished from the graveyard. Or cards like Thunder Dragon Roar, Resident Insect, Ghost Wyvern, Chaos Witch, Shiranui Samurai, and the 3 Sword Soul traps, which can all special summon other monsters if they're banished from the graveyard. Or cards like Thunder Dragon Dark, Dragon Matrix, Neptune, Ascension, Mercurier, Shiranui Squire, and all 4 Dragon Rulers, which allow you to gain advantage if they're banished from the graveyard. So not only are there a lot of really good cards with graveyard effects and cards which can use resources from the graveyard, these are also all really good targets to be removed from the graveyard with Mudora and Keldo, which shows you why they see play despite the fact that the other cards have been banned. And let's talk about the bannings. Currently, Kelback and yugioh are banned in all formats, with Keldo and Mudora being limited in all formats. And with how many decks have archetype specific cards that are good in the graveyard, or archetype-specific ways of reviving cards in the graveyard, it really shows how ridiculously powerful these 4 cards were. It's kind of insane that literally all of them are good and worked together so well, and came out with one of the best graveyard-centric decks ever made with the Tearlaments. As long as people are using transaction rollback to copy Needlebug Nest from the graveyard, the game is not at a point where Ishizu cards can be lifted off the ban list. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just too revolved around the graveyard, and being able to get so many pure resources into the graveyard so easily just kind of speeds up the game into a new level of power. Modern Tearlaments Ishizus can still beat pretty much any meta deck that currently exists, and it's kind of hard to see how they could possibly power creep again to get away from this, other than making floodgates more abundant. To say it again, the Ishizu cards do not fail because they're bad. On the contrary, they're so incredibly good that I doubt we'll ever see cards like them again. And in fact, I'd be surprised to see a yugioh or Kelback unbanned without some kind of errata. You know they messed up when basically all of their main cards are on the ban list, just like they did with the Dragon Rulers all those years ago.